We have bought every single PlayStation, from the humble beginnings of the PS1 all the way through to the incredibly successful PS4 and beyond. Stay tuned, my friends, because today I'm covering the full story of every single PlayStation, and some that never saw the light of day. Today, the word PlayStation is basically synonymous with gaming. Its impact stretches across decades, and generations of players have grown up with titles like Uncharted, Gran Turismo, and The Last of Us. I mean, just hearing the intro chime of the PS1 gives me goosebumps every single time. Blom, 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 blom. Blah, blah, blah. I'll work on my impression. The beginning of the story is kind of wild. Sony announced the Nintendo PlayStation, only for Nintendo out of nowhere to announce a partnership with Philips and completely burn Sony. Fueled by revenge, Sony struck out on their own and developed the only console to ever truly challenge and win against Nintendo, and the rest is history. But it is most definitely not that simple. The story actually begins years before the PlayStation ever saw the light of day. Ken Kutaragi, a hardware engineer inside Sony, believed deeply in the untapped potential of gaming. However, in the 1980s, Sony's focus was firmly on consumer electronics and entertainment, not toys. It seems wild in hindsight, but video games were still seen by many as a niche market. Undeterred, Kutaragi took a gamble that would change everything. He embarked on a secret project without letting most of senior Sony management know, which is always a really smart idea for furthering your career. He developed an advanced audio chip for Nintendo's upcoming Super Nintendo console. Now, the original NES was capable of making some iconic sounds and music, but there was clearly room for huge improvement. It's hard to understate just how much of a bold move this was within the rigid corporate structure of Sony. However, Kutaragi's gamble paid off spectacularly. Not only did his sound chip become a core component of the Super Nintendo, but it also served as a proof of concept. The success made Sony executives realize that gaming could actually be a lucrative venture. It's important to set the stage here. By 1990, the Japanese economy was booming, and there was a real sense of optimism, especially among Japanese electronics manufacturers who were newly flush with cash and confidence. These companies began looking beyond traditional electronics for what would be the next big thing. The growing video game industry suddenly looked like the perfect prospect. Fueled by the success of Nintendo's NES and the rising popularity of home computers, video games were growing quickly and captivating a wider audience than just kids. It was an easy pitch. Tech giants like Sony saw an opportunity to leverage their expertise in both hardware and software, not to mention doing something with those newfound piles of cash to carve out their own slice of this gaming pie. This wasn't just about profit either. There was a real incentive to show the world that you were the top tech company in the world, and video games really did represent the cutting edge of technology. At the time, the landscape was largely dominated by two companies, Sega and Nintendo. Their rivalry was the beginning of the first console war that has shaped so much of gaming since. After the success of the original NES, Sega fired the first shot with the Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis inside of North America. Its edgy marketing and faster-paced titles like Sonic were quote-unquote cool, and titles like Mortal Kombat brought all the blood and violence that you would not find on a Nintendo console. In comparison, the Super Nintendo, with its bright and vibrant graphics and classic titles like Super Mario World, was a huge leap forward over the NES, but we were living in a world of Nintendo. There was one clear winner in the cool factor, and it was Sega. And yet, a major disruptor loomed on the horizon, the advent of 3D. While not brand new, games like Star Fox on the Super Nintendo had proved that 3D was possible on consoles, but the technology very much remained in its infancy. In the arcades, Sega really was at the forefront. Their Model 1 and Model 2 arcade boards showcased the potential of 3D gaming. We're talking titles like Virtua Fighter, which wowed with its polygonal fighters, and Daytona USA in 1993, which absolutely blew minds with its smooth visuals and realistic racing experience. Well, mostly realistic at least. These arcade experiences gave gamers a taste of the next generation of gaming, fueling the appetite for true 3D gaming in the home. The race was on to bring immersive, polygon-based worlds to the living room, and Sony had one more major weapon in its arsenal: the CD. Co-developed with Philips in the early 80s, the CD format was huge for the music industry, and by the 1990s, CD manufacturing costs were dropping, making the tech attractive for gaming. Compared to cartridges, CDs offered way more storage for high-quality audio and even full-motion video, although maybe the less said about that, the better back in the early days. Yikes. The potential was clear, but it took a while to get started. Sega took the first major step with the Sega CD, an add-on for the Mega Drive released in 1992. While it showcased the potential of CD-based gaming, titles were often seen as expensive and gimmicky, not really showing off the format's capabilities. It also didn't help that it was very expensive, at $299 or $657 adjusted for inflation. Yeah, no wonder it didn't take off. As an add-on for a console you already had to own anyway. Despite this less than amazing start, there was a reason why people expected CD tech to be the next generation, and Sony were arguably positioned better than pretty much anyone else to bring that shiny optical disc to gamers everywhere. Fueled by the success of Kudaragi's gamble with the Super Nintendo sound chip, Sony were finally convinced to dip their toes deeper into the world of gaming. A small, dedicated team led by Kudaragi within Sony began exploring the concept of a standalone console designed to push the boundaries of 3D rendering. This was the beginning of what would eventually become the PlayStation project. With the opportunity of the CD format, Sony wanted a partnership to give them a foothold in the gaming space. The history with Nintendo made them a natural fit. The initial collaboration focused on creating a CD-ROM add-on for the wildly popular Super Nintendo. This seemed like a win-win scenario. Nintendo would gain extended capabilities for the console, while Sony would secure their entry into the console market. And so it was! All this was announced by Sony at CES of 1991. And the very next day, Nintendo announced that instead, they were partnering with Philips. Now, can we just take a minute? Can you just imagine something like this happening today? It's as if Sony announced that the Switch was getting support for PS5 games, and then the next day Nintendo goes, nah, never mind, we're just gonna run Android games. Look, it's absolutely wild. So what went wrong? Well, it seems that behind the scenes, tensions were brewing. The exact terms of this deal are still a little hazy even today, but supposedly, Nintendo executives grew uncomfortable with the terms of the deal, which would have given Sony considerable control over not only licensing, but also development for CD-based games. Additionally, there were concerns that the proposed Nintendo PlayStation leaned too heavily on Sony's branding, relegating the Nintendo part as a footnote for what would have probably been perceived as Sony's new console. Now, to show you just how close this got to the finish line, there are rumors that there was as far as a contract already being signed, which would make sense if you're going to announce it, but supposedly it was mysteriously voided by Nintendo's president at the 11th hour. Or I don't know, whatever hour you call it after you announced the f***ing thing already. Because remember, Sony has gone on stage saying, hey, the Sony PlayStation, it's a thing that works with Nintendo stuff. And then Nintendo said, what's up, Philips? Back in 1991, though, the fallout was swift and it was brutal. I mean, think about it. Sony, a company with a reputation for innovation and being on the top of the tech world, felt humiliated and betrayed. Ironically, this public embarrassment sparked a real sense of determination within the company, which before this kind of just treated gaming like a little side project. Senior executives at Sony, recognizing the potential of the gaming market, really got behind the idea of going it alone, developing their own console to directly challenge Nintendo's dominance. And boy oh boy did it! With the benefit of hindsight, you can make the argument that this was one of the biggest decisions in gaming history that directly led to the PlayStation that we know today. Meanwhile, Nintendo's new chosen partner in Philips brought out the heavily flawed CDI, an expensive mess of a console that spawned some of the worst games of all time.
Gee, it sure is boring around here.
It all set back Nintendo years. Even the successor to the Super Nintendo, the N64, only shipped a disc add-on way after the Sony PlayStation hit the market, and it was such a flop that not only did it not see a release outside of Japan, but many of the games that were planned for it ended up just being held back for the next generation GameCube. Whoops! So with all the backstory for context, what happened when Sony actually released the PlayStation? With a blank slate to start from, one of the first decisions was on specs. From their initial work focused around a 3D home console, Sony rejected the traditional 16-bit architecture of the era, instead opting for a cutting-edge for its day 32-bit RISC processor. This potent CPU gave the PlayStation the raw power to render complex 3D worlds in real time. Maybe not quite on par with Sega's arcade boards, but at a price point that people could actually afford. Alongside the powerful CPU, they equipped the PlayStation with a dedicated Geometry Transformation Engine, or GTE. This was a specialized part of the CPU responsible for the complex mathematical calculations that underpin 3D rendering. This was important because the concept of a GPU wasn't really well defined in the early 1990s, but the GTE hardware worked in tandem with the GPU to enable smooth polygon rendering, texture mapping, and advanced lighting effects. It was a fairly powerful piece of hardware for the time, especially as a first-generation effort. So much so, in fact, that Sony hid some of the more advanced features of the PlayStation until much later, including high-resolution modes for 2D content, texture filtering, and more. Surprise, surprise, it was also terrific for playing CDs, with audio quality that rivaled some of the very best audiophile-grade CD players of the day. As you might imagine, as a brand new platform from a company with no real history in gaming, initially a lot of developers were skeptical. The PlayStation's focus on 3D graphics was such a huge departure from the 2D sprite-based games of the time that an all-new approach really was required. I mean, just imagine how big of a complete rethinking of game design was to go from Mario Kart to Gran Turismo. However, developers quickly saw the potential. The PlayStation's emphasis on 3D opened up enormous possibilities for creating immersive worlds, cinematic storytelling, and gameplay experiences that were just simply not possible on previous generations of consoles. Sony was also smart in making things fairly easy for developers. The PlayStation's development tools were considered relatively accessible for the time, and Sony actively tried to attract third-party developers, knowing that no console could survive without good games to stand on. This stood in stark contrast with the main competitor at the time, which was the Sega Saturn. Now, the Saturn was a very technically impressive console that ended up borrowing a lot from the arcade boards, but it was enormously complicated to develop for, with a dual CPU architecture and a high $399 price tag in the US. In comparison, when it came time for Sony to announce the price of the PlayStation, they summed it up pretty quickly.
$299.
I feel like I've seen this clip before. None of this mattered though. Both critics and gamers alike bought in early. Reviewers praised the console's 3D graphics, and that $300 price point really helped propel PlayStation to instant success. They sold 2 million units in the first 6 months in Japan and had lines out the door in the United States. Meanwhile, Sega tried to get the drop on Sony by surprisingly announcing that the Saturn was going on sale immediately, except they forgot to inform retailers, some of whom were so mad that they didn't even stock the Saturn. You know, as much as hard work plays a big role in these things, it really helps when your competitors are too busy shooting themselves in the foot to even compete with you. And with that, the PlayStation was well and truly off to the races. Throughout 1995 and 1996, gamers really began to see what the console was capable of. Games such as Resident Evil, Tekken, and Wipeout all pushed gaming far beyond what was capable on the older 16-bit sprite-based consoles and made the PlayStation look like a killer upgrade. If you could distill my childhood down to a couple of noises, those are the sounds. Gran Turismo was not only the #1 selling game for the PlayStation, Gran Turismo 2 was like the 3rd best-selling game, but it's hard to understate just how much of a leap this was. Before this, we had titles such as Daytona USA, which was a great game, but it was very arcadey. This was one of the first times that video games had actually seen a more realistic racing simulator. And the thing is, Sony did a lot of really smart moves with this console. You had like proper actual soundtracks, right? Like you're listening to CD audio right now. It wasn't just one of those things where it was just some 8-bit chiptune kind of thing. Like it was like an actually like really good soundtrack. I think a big reason why the PlayStation was successful was because Sony were able to go into this generation without a sort of playbook for how they needed to do things, right? I mean, you know, for the 3D generation, I mean, we're talking about the N64 for Nintendo, and at that point, the game was very well established. You know, you had to have Mario, you had to have, you know, obviously some incredibly cutting-edge titles like Donkey Kong, but like, ultimately, it was a console that had to be a Nintendo console. Like, that was the mold that had been set. But for Sony, they could kind of do whatever they wanted. And not only did they start to develop a lot of first-party titles in this sort of generation, but also the third-party support was huge because they could actually develop proper cinematic games like Final Fantasy. You could take advantage of the CD format and have proper audio. You'd have so much more to work with. And Sony did a lot of smart decisions as far as like making it easy to develop for. Oh no. No! Ghost, come back! No, past Austin! All right. Look, I could sit here and talk to you about Gran Turismo all day long. You see the smile on my face right now? That is what this game gives me. But let's also talk about a couple of other games, including Tomb Raider. Look at this. Look at this. It's a cutscene in a video game. Imagine that. We're FaceTiming right now. This seems so old, but this is like actually cinematic storytelling in a video game. We take it for granted today. This is something that the PlayStation was hugely influential in actually bringing out. Are we gonna go save him? Ah, is that blood? Oh my god, did I just see blood? Oh no! Did we accidentally shoot our friend? No, we shot him, no! Well, we're on our own. So if you look closely, actually this is a good example. Look like on the wall here. You see this kind of like weird like artifacting? That was one of the downsides of the original PlayStation. I'm not entirely sure why the PlayStation handled graphics in this way. It was something to do with the way it handled triangles, I think. It certainly was not ideal, but it definitely gave PlayStation 1 games a very sort of distinctive look. By the time Nintendo finally released the N64 in late 1996, the PlayStation had been on sale for 2 years and was the dominant gaming console. While technically more powerful, the N64 was held back by its expensive, low-capacity cartridges, while the PlayStation enjoyed its cheap, easy-to-manufacture CDs and the control situation. Someone at Nintendo looked at the N64 controller and said, "F it, let's ship it." Or at least, I assume so. I don't know what they actually said, but I'm not sure why. You look at this and say, "Sign me up, Captain." Meanwhile, Sony iterated on the already excellent PlayStation controller with the DualShock, incorporating not only the much-needed analog sticks, but also including a rumble feature which, and yes, this might be my bias showing here, but it ran absolute rings around the stupid N64 controller. In 2000, Sony released the PS1, a slim, redesigned version of the original PlayStation. This smaller, more affordable model really revitalized the console's sales and extended its lifespan deep into the next generation. While the PS1 continued to draw in new players, the competition had evolved significantly. In 2001, Nintendo released the GameCube, while around the same time, Microsoft entered the fray with the powerful Xbox. Despite facing rivals with far more power, the PlayStation's late life cycle was a period of incredibly good games for the platform. We're talking about classics like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, and Tony Hawk's Pro Skater that did a lot to keep the PlayStation relevant. It's kind of crazy to think about the PlayStation's longevity. Its official production didn't end until 2006, a full 6 years after the PlayStation 2's launch. It's no wonder that the PlayStation was the best-selling console ever in its time, only to be passed by none other than the PlayStation 2. By the end of the PlayStation 1 lifecycle, no game console manufacturer had been able to dominate 2 generations back-to-back. Sure, the Super Nintendo was certainly a successful follow-up to the NES, but it fought a long, hard battle against the Sega Genesis that it only barely came out on top of. That's nearly 30 years of rivals constantly one-upping each other. So while the PlayStation won the 90s console war, there was no guarantee that someone else wouldn't snatch the gaming crown right back around this time. In a way, Sony was kind of lucky. Ken Kutaragi, the father of the PlayStation, had so much passion that he basically forced Sony into the gaming industry. There was an enormous amount of skepticism inside Sony about the gaming project, but with year after year of climbing sales, no one could deny their success. So with cautious optimism, Sony committed to a second-generation console. This time though, there was a lot more to lose. When Sony launched the PS1, they didn't know it would be a big hit, but good old Ken Kutaragi had complete confidence, so naturally he had already started working on the PS2 immediately after the original PlayStation launched, and before, importantly, Sony had even greenlit a second generation. I swear, this guy was just trying to get fired. The development timeline in the early days is a little shaky. Multiple companies reported working on a potential graphics chip for the PS2 as early as 1997. It quickly became clear, though, that those were either to confuse competitors or likely as backup options, because Sony is working on something revolutionary in-house. With the help of Toshiba, Sony developed the now legendary Emotion Engine CPU. Unlike traditional CPUs of the era, the Emotion Engine integrated several specialized units to maximize performance for the demands that are more specific to gaming. This included a streamlined MIPS CPU core to handle general processing, 2 vector processing units for complex graphics calculations, a dedicated image processing unit, and more. This hybrid approach in a lot of ways actually foreshadowed the trends that we see today in processor design, where when you buy a CPU, what you're actually getting is something which is made up of a bunch of specialized components that work together on a single chip to maximize efficiency. Compare this to the Sega Dreamcast's more traditional CPU. Simpler, less potential raw power, but easier to get good results quickly. The PS2 might not have been as straightforward to work with as something like the Nintendo GameCube, or have the brute force of the Xbox with its PC-based processor. But For a developer who knew how to optimize around the Emotion engine, the PS2 had a ton of potential. The PlayStation 2's graphics synthesizer was also a huge step forward for console graphics. In particular, the leap from the PS1's graphics was astronomical. The original PlayStation could only manage a theoretical 360,000 polygons per second, while the PS2 pushed a staggering 75 million. Just pause for a second and take that in. These days, if you get 2, maybe 3 times more performance across the generation, it's considered a solid upgrade. The PS2 could handle 207 times more polygons. This translated to far more complex environments, smoother character models, and intricate details that really brought games to life. In my opinion, it is the biggest leap in graphics for a single generation of all time, and it almost certainly will never be matched again. But perhaps the biggest galaxy-brained move Sony made was including a DVD-ROM drive. Remember, Sony was, and still kind of is, a consumer tech company first and foremost. As a company making cameras, TVs, and physical media, they knew that consumers were right at the start of a major shift from analog media like VHS tapes to digital DVDs. With PS2 games living on DVD, there was suddenly way more space than CDs, between 6 and 12 times as much. No more 3-disc Final Fantasy games. Now, this might sound silly today, when physical media is kind of on its deathbed, but I know a ton of people who sold their parents on the PS2, not just as a game console, but as a media center for the whole family. Now, to really drive sales, Sony priced the PS2 at $299 at launch, the exact same price as the original PlayStation back in 1995, but importantly, significantly less expensive than most standalone DVD players at the time. So, if your family wanted to start watching some high-quality DVD movies, it really was an easy sell. Speaking of launch, the PS2 finally was released in the year 2000. Let's just say it wasn't the smoothest launch. It was a roller coaster of equal parts hype and frustration, with massive console shortages pretty much everywhere. Now, at the time, Sony was selling each PS2 at a loss, a gamble that they make money on game sales later on down the line. Now, this strategy is really the norm now, but back in 2000, it's easy to forget that Sony was a relative newcomer in the console wars and honestly had no idea how many people were really ready to upgrade their PS1s. Sony just weren't prepared for the demand they'd created, and it got so bad that you could get a PS2 on eBay for more than double retail price. Some of them were priced as high as $1,000, and this is in 2000. The launch games were also pretty disappointing. Now, leading up to launch, Sony teased a lot of highly anticipated titles, like Metal Gear Solid 2, Gran Turismo 2000. What gamers got instead were 29 fine but not exciting games, like Madden NFL 2001 and Dynasty Warriors 2. It didn't really matter though. The PS2 sold like absolute hotcakes. Sony sold all 1 million manufactured units in the launch weekend alone. A lot of this was thanks to another smart decision by Sony: backwards compatibility. Again, this is something we pretty much take for granted today, and we all get super up in arms when a new console doesn't have a generation or even several generations of perfect back compat. With the PS2 though, Sony cleverly reused the original PS1 CPU to handle I/O tasks such as the USB ports in normal PS2 mode, but as soon as you dropped an OG PlayStation disc in, the hardware sprang into action. Now, it did need a little bit of emulation for some certain features of the PS1, such as the audio chip, but thanks to the massive leap in power on tap, PlayStation 1 games pretty much universally just worked. After the PS2's global launch, it only gained more steam. Sony quickly ramped up production to try and meet the massive demand, but shortages continued throughout the first year. This was coupled with a big marketing campaign that did a lot to cement the PS2 as the must-have gaming device. Ads highlighted its graphics power, PS1 game library, the added bonus of being a DVD player. Boy, there were some, I don't know if I want to call it gems, but some, this is a commercial.
Welcome to the third place.
This combination of hype, features, and slowly increasing availability fueled a frenzy that propelled the PS2 to console market dominance by the end of its first year. But the first big test came in 2001, when the real competition arrived. Now, before we get to the console war, we've got to press F to pay respects for Sega. As much as I love the Dreamcast, it just couldn't keep up with the competition. Not only did Sony thoroughly have the momentum over Sega, but even though the Dreamcast had a 1-year head start, the PS2's spectacular launch, paired with EA's decision to not develop for the Dreamcast, basically forced it into early retirement, and it was discontinued in 2001. Rest in peace, little guy. Enjoy your VMUs in the cold, watery grave of wherever that dolphin lives. Or the fish guy. What was the fish guy named? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Y'all never seen that?
I may not look so hot to you, but you should see yourselves through my eyes. You don't know me, but you will.
With one competitor down, Sony didn't have the luxury of relaxing. 2001 was when Nintendo's GameCube and Microsoft's Xbox launched, marking one of the biggest generational rivalries in gaming history. On paper, it seemed like Sony was in trouble. Remember, this was Nintendo's big chance to get back at Sony for crushing the N64 in the last generation, and they went hard. In some ways, the GameCube was more powerful and easy to work with than the PS2, and importantly, it cost $100 less. Then you had the Xbox, built from straight-up PC parts like an Intel Pentium CPU and NVIDIA GeForce graphics, making it, on paper, by far the most powerful gaming console in this generation. I mean, just look at this comparison. It took a few years for developers to really get the most out of the Emotion Engine and graphics synthesizer, where Nintendo and Microsoft offered consoles that devs were able to get solid performance out of pretty much on day one. And so there was a fierce battle, just not with Sony. Throughout the PS2's production run, Sony consistently had more than 50% of the market share. The Xbox and GameCube would fight and often trade blows, but ultimately they were fighting for a distant second place. So where did they go wrong? Well, Nintendo hit multiple roadblocks. A lot of popular third-party games, like the Grand Theft Auto series, simply skipped development for the GameCube. This might not sound all that strange these days, but this was back when Nintendo absolutely wanted cross-platform titles, just like the other consoles. The failure to attract a lot of them directly led Nintendo to pretty much give up fighting the console war on even footing and started making weird stuff like the Wii and the Wii U, but that's a story for later. Probably the biggest reason the GameCube fell behind was the lack of DVD functionality. After the failure of the Sony partnership with Nintendo to develop a CD-based add-on for the Super Nintendo, they spent the entire N64 generation backing cartridges, which left them with essentially no experience with discs. When Nintendo finally decided to switch to the disc format, they opted for the tiny mini optical discs that you see with the GameCube. The public reason why Nintendo did this was because these smaller discs could load data faster than traditional DVDs, which in some cases it did. But the real reason was almost certainly because they were, and still are, terrified of piracy. It's pretty well documented that Nintendo hates piracy. Emulators and other legal things. Sorry, something's in my throat. But it's clear that Nintendo have done a lot of things to prevent piracy, even if it makes the gaming experience worse for those of you who buy the games legally. Aside from Nintendo, the big new rival that no one saw coming was the Microsoft Xbox. The first American game console since all the way back in 1993 with the Atari Jaguar, Xbox's launch was actually quite successful, all things considered. Selling 1.5 million units in its first year, the Xbox was born as a way to leverage Windows, build an ecosystem, and to prevent Sony from decimating the gaming PC market. When you think of it that way, it makes a lot of sense that Microsoft made a console that was actually quite PC-like. The Xbox could even play DVDs, kind of like the PS2, although you did need a remote and a dongle just to enable playback. Like a PC, the Xbox offered features that were a major step forward compared to console rivals. Forget having to fumble with tiny memory cards. The Xbox boasted a built-in hard drive, which offered tons of storage for not only saved games, but even downloaded content. But the Xbox had two major issues. Firstly, it was a financial black hole. Even with strong game sales, Microsoft was losing a significant amount of money on each console sold. Estimates suggest that they may have been losing at least $100 per unit. To make matters worse, just to stay competitive with the PS2 and GameCube, they were forced to slash the Xbox's price just 6 months after launch. Secondly, the console never gained traction in crucial markets like Japan, where Xbox sold less than 500,000 consoles throughout its entire lifespan. Yikes. The controller was also a problem, but that's for another video. Now, I want to make it clear, these were not bad consoles. Both the GameCube and Xbox are looked back on fondly by most gamers. But the thing is, the biggest problem with both the GameCube and Xbox was a really simple one. They just weren't PS2s. Wait. No, the game was supposed the game's supposed to launch. Sorry, one second. Let me just, is my disk drive not working on my PS2? This would be a great time to remind you that game preservation is important, because hardware fails, emulators don't. Oh, what an interesting idea. If only backwards compatibility could save the day. Perfect. All right, look at our PS2. It's all good to go. Anyway, this is Gran Turismo 4, my favorite Gran Turismo game of all time. Oh no, I see artifacts already. Look at the top left corner. I'm really surprised. I've not played Gran Turismo 4 in probably 15 years. And how similar it feels to even newer games like Gran Turismo 7. Like, it really is a testament to how much Polyphony put into this game and how hard they tried to make it the ultimate driving simulator. And it, even all this time later, still feels surprisingly good. I'm going so fast, that's 150 miles an hour. That felt surprisingly like home. And I think that just is a testament to not only the performance and sort of how far ahead of its time the PS2 really was. It wasn't the most powerful console when it came to raw specs, but it had a clever design. There was a lot of headroom for developers to really optimize over the life cycle. And importantly, they sold over 100 million of these things, which meant that developers had tons of incentive to get every ounce of performance out of the PS2. It took a while for them to really get that most out of it, but with games towards the end of the generation, like Gran Turismo 4, like some of the GTA titles, you could really see what this hardware is capable of. You know what? PS2, you got a healthy future ahead of you. In 2005, Sony announced the PS2 sold 100 million consoles, the first game console to ever sell that many units that quickly. Even more impressive, they did it in only 5 years. Sony wasn't just twiddling their thumbs as the sales shot to the moon. They had a number of hardware revisions, very similar to how PlayStation still does it today for modern consoles. Over time, the PS2 lost the PCM-CIA card slot, but gained a hard drive expansion bay, better networking and power efficiency, redesigned motherboard, along with more reliable disk readers, which we'll talk about a little later. They also got much better at manufacturing, cutting costs, and eventually dropping the price from $299 down to $199. But probably the biggest hardware revision was the slim PS2. Sony crammed the main bits of the PS2 fat into the Slim, which was about a third the size and less than half the weight. Now, I'm not going to say that it was revolutionary, but it really was one of the smallest gaming consoles ever. It did drop the motorized disc tray and hard drive, and you needed to now use an external power supply, but they kept the networking, and over the years, even the Slim had a few revisions, mostly with the internals, like merging the Emotion engine with the GPU, and ditching the PS1 CPU so a more efficient chip could emulate PS1 games instead. I'll say my personal favorite hardware revision though is pretty much the exact opposite of the PS2 Slim, the PSX. While you might not be familiar with it, since it was mostly a Japanese exclusive release in 2003, the PSX was a unique addition to the PlayStation family. It's more than just a bigger PS2. The PSX also introduced the XMB interface that would go on to live in both the PS3 as well as the PSP. Personally, I think it's the best looking PS2 model, and it still looks modern even today. This bad boy was a digital video recorder just like a TiVo, it came with a remote, had an S-video, composite, RF inputs, you could also do analog VHF and TV tuning. I mean, the icing on the cake was even the USB link to a PSP where you can transfer your photos, music, and videos. Like, look, there was so much that this thing could do, I cannot stress enough how much of a multimedia monster it was. With all of these features came a premium price to match. The PSX launched at 79,800 yen, which was about $740 back in 2003. Adjusted for inflation for 2024, this would have been almost a $1,200 PlayStation. Yeah. A huge jump even with all those cool features. If you want to know more about the PSX, Ken did a terrific video all about it on Denki, which you should actually go check out, even though, spoiler alert, he broke our PSX. No, it was fine and you broke it. It was totally fine when I had it. Over the years, Sony came out with a few more interesting iterations of the PS2, including the PS2 TV, which was a PlayStation 2 directly integrated into a Sony Bravia LCD TV. There's also a Linux kit for the PS2, so enthusiasts could turn a PS2 basically into a PC, complete with web browsing and other computery things. Not to mention tons of special edition consoles. Sony sold millions of PS2s and overwhelmingly dominated the gaming market for a second generation in a row, so it must have been flawless, right? Not exactly. There were actually still plenty of issues with the PS2. One of the biggest advantages of the Xbox over the PlayStation 2 was its excellent online functionality. Now, both the PS2 and Xbox could connect to the internet to have multiplayer experiences, but it really seemed much more like an afterthought on the PS2. Online services were free for most games on the PS2, but Sony didn't have any dedicated servers. They left it up to developers to host servers to game on, which led to a spotty and inconsistent online experience. Xbox, on the other hand, had dedicated servers which made multiplayer so much better. They did charge for it though through Xbox Live, but you got a lot for the price, like personal gamer tags, adding friends online, messaging. It felt a lot more like modern gaming. It was pretty night and day. Unfortunately, reliability was also a concern for many PS2s. One common problem was the disc tray, which had a reputation for breaking down over time. In fact, if something's gonna break on a PS2, the disc tray is a likely culprit. It was such a big issue that there was even a class action lawsuit against Sony. The lawsuit claimed the PS2s regularly displayed the disk read error message and would not play games. There were a lot of other issues, like memory cards getting corrupted, being too small capacity to start with, and being far too expensive. It's almost like Sony can't resist charging a pile of money for a proprietary media format. Now, some PS2s also had overheating issues, especially on the slim models, and of course, frustrating worn out power buttons that needed to be replaced. And yet, despite all of those issues, the PS2 is, without exaggeration, the best-selling gaming console of all time. Yes, that's right, even in the year 2024, no other console has surpassed the godly 155 million sales record that the PS2 set. The PS1 made Sony into a genuine gaming powerhouse, but the PS2 launched Sony into the stratosphere. The PlayStation brand solidified its status as a household name synonymous with gaming. Just like how all Pokemon are just Pikachu to boomers, all video game consoles were just PlayStations. It's easy to see how PlayStation became the face of gaming at the time. They even kept making them for 13 whole years. AKA, I can't believe this is true, they only stopped making PS2s months before the PS4 came out. You know, like they kept making PS2s pretty much the entire lifespan of the PlayStation 3. I remember when the PS2 was the must-have console, and let me tell you, if you were the one kid in your town that didn't have a PS2, it was a miserable Christmas. Not that I was that kid or anything, I was perfectly happy with my PS1. Mom? Actually, can I tell a story? My dad tried to get a PS2 for me from a friend from work, and I was really excited about it. We went over to his house, and when we went to go pick it up, he thought it was a PS2 and it was actually a PS1. I don't think I've ever emotionally recovered from that. The PS2's legacy for not only gaming, but bringing gaming to the mainstream is undeniable. Despite its shortcomings, it stood head and shoulders over the competition. But I have a feeling that PlayStation's rivals won't just roll over and let Sony take the gaming crown for good. Or will they? Spoiler alert, they don't. That's it! They won the console war! It's all done, time to pack it up! What could possibly be next for the best-selling gaming brand in the world? I mean, surely they'll just play it safe and double down on what works, right? Wrong. Instead, they decided to challenge the reigning champs of handheld gaming, Nintendo. Sony basically looked at the Game Boy and said, we can do better, and went straight for the jugular. Can you tell they like to hold a grudge? Sony first ventured into the handheld gaming market long ago, even before the PS2. This foray was more than a little obscure compared to the big-ticket handhelds like the PSP and the Vita, partially because it was a device that was only released in Japan. In 1999, Sony sold the Pocket Station. It was just a little guy that looked like a Tamagotchi that was about the size of a pair of AirPods. It was a combination PlayStation 1 memory card and handheld gaming device. That sounds familiar because it is very, very similar to Sega's VMU for the Dreamcast, which also combined memory and minigames. The Pocket Station had an LCD screen, flash memory, and even had sound, a true technological marvel. Some PlayStation games, such as Final Fantasy VII, offered mini-games or additional content designed for use with the Pocket Station. Now, while the device was popular in Japan, it never was officially released worldwide, likely due to a strategic decision by Sony to focus on the upcoming PS2, which was of course right on the horizon. That relative success fueled Sony's true portable ambitions. You might see what they thought they could take on the reigning champ, Nintendo, whose Game Boy had become synonymous with handheld gaming. But by the 2000s, Nintendo had been making handheld gaming devices for over 20 years and dominated the market for more than half that time. The Game Boy in every iteration was the gold standard for portable gaming. The Game Boy did face some competition from more powerful rivals such as Sega's Game Gear and Atari's Lynx, boasting backlit displays and superior graphics. Although, let's be honest, viewed by today's standards, these all sucked. The Lynx and Game Gear were just a little less terrible. Gaming magazines at the time gave glowing reviews and said that the Lynx throws the Game Boy back into the prehistoric age. So why then did the primitive Game Boy that was left totally powerless without the light from a passing street lamp through the window in the backseat of your dad's Accord, or the Game Boy that didn't, have a backlit display? Like, how could this become the king of the hill? Well, really, the Game Boy's dominance came down to two main factors: batteries and games. Handhelds like the Game Gear and Lynx were more advanced, sure. The Game Gear could display 32 colors at once out of a max palette of 4,096 compared to the Game Boy's measly 4 shades of green. But as we know from modern handhelds, more power takes more battery. In the olden days, that meant more AA batteries. I don't know about you, but my parents weren't happy with needing 2 or 4 AA's a week for my Game Boy Color, let alone, 12 AA's a week for your Game Gear. And while the games for the Game Gear and the Lynx were more sophisticated from a graphics standpoint, the Game Boy, with its iconic titles like Pokemon, Kirby, and Mario, offered a more accessible and family-friendly experience. Now, plenty of other handhelds did come and go throughout the 90s, from the Neo Geo to the WonderSwan, all with their own unique take on the gaming handheld. But Nintendo continued to steamroll the competition, and with each generation they dominated the market. So Sony knew they had to bring something special to the table to dethrone the Game Boy. What about, and I know this is a revolutionary concept, a portable PlayStation? That naming conversation must have been so easy. Sony's strategy was simple: outgun Nintendo on the hardware front. The Game Boy Advance that was on sale at the time was a terrific console for 2D-based Super Nintendo-style sprite graphics. But ultimately, it was just a better version of the 1989 Game Boy. There was plenty of hype for what would eventually be the PlayStation Portable even before its 2004 release. Then CEO of PlayStation, shout out Ken Kutaragi, he teased the device as, quote, the Walkman of the 21st century. Now, while the comparison was vague, the technical specs they announced generated a lot of excitement about the potential of a portable PlayStation handheld. It used a cutting-edge 32-bit MIPS R32 CPU, originally clocked at 222 MHz, but later pushed to 333 MHz with a 3.50 firmware update. Also, just side note, imagine today you get like an update for your Switch and suddenly it's like overclocked by 50%. Like, man, these were the days. Actually, Nintendo should do that actually, because they could technically just set the Switch clocks to like where they're supposed to be, but they just didn't. Sony did though. They didn't just settle for making something equivalent to a portable PS1. Sony aimed higher to create a handheld that could rival the PS2's mighty emotion engine and graphic synthesizer. This is unlike what Nintendo ended up doing with the DS that was also in development at the same time, which had much less ambitious performance targets, closer to something like the last generation N64. Let's just pause for a second to truly grasp the significance of this ambition. Nowadays, almost 2 decades later, we're used to devices like the Steam Deck, which are able to run modern AAA games, but at significantly lower settings. The PSP was aiming to come close to the cutting edge of consoles at the time. Sony's ambition didn't just stop at raw power. They also took another lesson from a big feature of the PS2, multimedia. While the DVD drive was off the table, probably more so because it wasn't proprietary enough for Sony, they instead outfitted the PSP with a tiny optical drive dubbed the UMD. Now these are little discs to play not only games, but also movies and music videos. With each weighing in at either 900 megabytes or 1.8 gigabytes, they were impressively dense for something so small, comfortably more so than a CD, and enough space to hold a full-length movie. Now, if you didn't want to carry dozens of UMD discs around, users could also load it up with their own video files and MP3s. It also supported downloading games with the proprietary Memory Stick Duo, which was a feature that came a couple years after launch, and that certainly improved things even further. With 4 to 5 hours of video playback and 8 to 11 hours of audio playback, the PSP was a true multimedia powerhouse. Keep in mind that this was 3 whole years before the first iPhone was even a thing. All those features meant that it was not going to be a cheap handheld. In the US, the PSP cost $250 at launch, which was quite expensive for the time. For context, Nintendo rolled out the DS with a $150 price tag, a much more reasonable amount, especially considering that the Game Boy had been around that $100 mark for years at that point. Despite the high price, the launch of the PSP was a success. In Japan, Sony sold more than 200,000 units on launch day. When it was eventually released in the US in early 2005, they sold about 500,000 units for the launch weekend. In fact, they sold so well that it was difficult to keep up with demand, and it pushed the entire global launch back just because they couldn't make enough of the damn things. Now, the UK launch at the end of 2005 sold through their entire stock of 185,000 units in 3 hours. Almost 1 million units were sold across Europe in the first week of sales. But Nintendo's DS was looming in the background, and it was clear that Nintendo weren't going to give up the golden goose without a fight. In November of 2004, a few months before the PSP went on sale in North America, the DS sold about 500,000 units in the US alone. Sales quickly ramped up to 1 million units by the end of 2004, largely thanks to people trampling each other during Black Friday. At this point, the stage was set for a fierce battle. The PSP's launch was a resounding success, but Sony wasn't just going to sit back and chill. Over the years, Sony iterated and made some really iconic PSPs. The original PSP 1000, known as the Fat PSP, was the heaviest PSP, but for good reason. It had the biggest battery at 1800 mAh, compared to a much smaller 1200 mAh cell on later models. The LCD panels were considered some of the worst in the PSP lineup. Although it wasn't too bad compared to the DS, it was prone to ghosting and high response times. Now, I'm certainly biased here, since I did have a 1000, but it still feels the most solid in my opinion, and it was one of many Sony consoles, where the first version was best in a lot of ways before later models cut costs to bring the price tag down. Learning from the original PSP's shortcomings, Sony released the PSP 2000, also known as the Slim. The 2000 addressed some of the screen quality issues of its predecessor, as well as the general bulkiness, although this slimmer design did come at the cost of that smaller 1200 mAh battery. Although users did find workarounds, as you could technically fit the older, bigger batteries from the 1000 into the 2000, just as long as you don't mind not being able to put a back cover on. Now, importantly, they also doubled the RAM from 32 to 64 megabytes, which was a legitimate upgrade and led to noticeably faster load times. Significantly, this model also marked the first major price drop in the PSP lifecycle, going from $250 to $169 for the core pack system, basically the PSP without all the extra accessories. Building on the Slim success, the PSP 3000 further refined the handheld's design and is generally known as the best PSP from an overall perspective. It kept all the upgrades from the 2000 and also featured an upgraded screen, which was brighter and offered better contrast, pixel response, and less glare. It was unofficially known as the Bright model, especially in marketing, and it did make for a noticeably better gaming experience. Unless you're really sensitive to scan lines, or slightly inaccurate colors. Now, the software was a lot more locked down at this point, a response to something we'll talk about in a little bit later, but here's the thing. Sony wasn't satisfied with just improving the PSP. They clearly wanted to push the boundaries of handheld design. Remember, this is the old Sony, who made the bizarre Vio systems all through the 2000s. It's almost like they looked at one of those old, remember the LG sliding phones? They're like, hey, let's do that, except for the PSP. Well, they did, and it was the PSP Go. It was a bold experiment that perhaps pushed the tech of the day just a little too far. Despite the PSP's already compact size, Sony aimed to make it even smaller with the Go. They started by eliminating the UMD drive in favor of digital downloads. They They added 16 gigabytes of expandable flash storage, and they got rid of about a quarter of the weight. That means that they went all digital, which I probably don't need to tell you was controversial to say the least all the way back in 2009. 15 years later, we're only just starting to properly phase out physical media, so I'm sure that that didn't hurt sales at all for the oh wait, no, actually it did. It hurt like significantly, like a lot. There aren't any official numbers, but the PSP Go most likely sold less than 1 million units total, a drop in the bucket compared to the 80+ million PSPs sold overall. The quirky sliding form factor with the tiny button layout, the lack of a physical drive, and the more expensive retail price of $250 was just a recipe for disaster, even though I've always irrationally loved it. Recognizing the need for a more affordable option, Sony introduced the PSP Street in 2011. Even at $170 for the regular 3000 model, it was still consistently a bit more expensive than the Nintendo DS line, specifically the massive selling DS Lite. As the last PSP to be released, the 2011 Street was a budget-focused version similar to the 3000, except it got rid of some very important features like Wi-Fi and stereo speakers, not to mention it cheapened the build quality quite a bit. For all the cost cutting, you could at least get it for a very affordable €99. I say euro because they mostly sold it in Europe as well as in some parts of Asia as well as Australia. Now, despite its budget-oriented design, the PSP Street actually wasn't as bad as it might have seemed. The screen was improved, and performance-wise, it was actually a little better than the standard 3000, with loading times that were either on par or improved from every other PSP edition. So surely, all those improvements, coupled with a strong launch, meant the PSP won the handheld console war, right? Right? Now, in our quest to get our hands on every bit of PSP paraphernalia that has ever existed, I have this, a PSP dev kit. Now, we actually did a video on this. We did a mystery tech a little while ago. In fact, probably a couple years ago at this point. And what's cool about this is that this has a lot of special features, including the ability to play not only UMDs, but also DVDs, and it has a bunch of debug stuff. It's a neat little Easter egg into the past. Also, I'm not giving it back. Sony, not supposed to have dev kits. They get kind of grumpy about it. Probably the biggest issue with the PSP was the fact that it only had a single analog stick. Now, it was fine, it was doable, but this actually really held you back for certain types of games because without the ability to use dual analog sticks, your control method was oftentimes going back and forth on the same hand between the analog stick and the D-pad, back and forth. And that was not great, especially for some games where you wanted to, look and aim at the same time. Even though this technically was really quite powerful, it always felt like it never fully lived up to its potential in a way that today you don't really see a mobile version of like a Switch game. Like you just get the game. Maybe it doesn't look as good, but you get that full experience. But with the PSP, this was still back in an era where a mobile version of a game was almost always a more watered down experience. So it just kind of goes to show that if a developer had the time and money to fully commit to the PSP, you could get great results. But so many titles felt like they were like 80% the sort of full potential that they had. While the PSP racked up a respectable 81 million units sold worldwide, the Nintendo DS sold a staggering 154 million units. That's almost twice as many sales. So what went wrong? Well, let's cut to the chase. The PSP was not a failure. I asked what went wrong, but honestly, nothing really did go horribly wrong. On the contrary, the PSP is still the best-selling non-Nintendo gaming handheld of all time. For some context, the PSP sold almost 4 times as many consoles as the GameCube, about as many units as the Game Boy Advance, and almost as many sales as the original PlayStation, all of which are viewed as successful and beloved game consoles. Well, maybe the GameCube was a little bit more beloved than successful, but look, this handheld generation was just a unique one. The Nintendo DS was dominant, but Sony did sell a lot of PSPs, just not quite as many. There are a few key reasons for this. Partially, the smartphone revolution began during this generation, but a big one was that the DS was just simply cheaper. The DS also had a much bigger game library that appealed to a broader audience. The DS's most popular games included titles such as Nintendogs, which, fun fact, is actually the second best-selling DS game as long as you bundle all of the individual versions together, and it had an overwhelmingly female player base. Compare that to the PSP, which had a decidedly more brewed up, cool demo, with some of the most popular games being Grand Theft Auto and Monster Hunter and God of War. You can kind of guess what kind of demo those games were targeted toward. There's no Nintendogs on PSP. That Invisimals, which was far inferior. The PSP's unintentionally open platform for customization and homebrew was thanks to the easy hacks that were absolutely everywhere, but it was a double-edged sword. While it fostered a passionate community of modders and tinkerers, it also made the PSP a haven for piracy, and Sony were not happy. I remember you could load up movies, games, and some other more adult things. Believe me when I say, the PSP was a real eye-opener for me.
PlayStation Portable.
That opens up Pandora's box.
As the first device I owned with Wi-Fi and a portable browser, it was a very seminal moment in young Austin's life. I mean, some real great features. The PSP was just a special device. Now, some parents maybe expressed concerns about the PSP's very open nature, and this, paired with piracy, did almost certainly dent some of the PSP's momentum. Sony also played whack-a-mole with updates meant to shut down custom firmwares, which are mildly successful for a bit, but largely just served to annoy the modding community. Sony's marketing efforts for the PSP were also often, shall we say, misguided, failing to highlight its cool features and generating plenty of controversy. Just like with the PS2, I don't know what Sony were thinking with the marketing on the PSP. I mean, from an ad that, quote, "take a running jump here" on a train platform, to a racially charged warning that PlayStation Portable White is coming. Holy shit. I know that was a long time ago, but no. Now, I'm not gonna say that Nintendo's touching is good marketing campaign was much better. Good lord. But at least that one was a little more cringe and not controversial, just sort of stupid. The PSP, though, really did push the limits on how powerful a gaming handheld could be. It aimed to replicate the full console experience on the go, and it came really close. Meanwhile, the DS just took a different approach. In that regard, Sony was ahead of its time. I mean, it's only recently, with the Steam Deck and ROG Allies of the world, that we've had console-level handhelds again. I think it's safe to say that people are really appreciating the PSP-ness of handhelds these days. You wrote the line! You can't laugh at me, but you wrote the line! There's no way around it, though. The DS, with its innovative dual screen and touchscreen interface, it really revolutionized handheld gaming. And a lot of games like WarioWare or Zelda Phantom Hourglass were much more creative and took advantage of the dual screens, the touch input, and even the microphone, like giving your Nintendogs commands. Sit! Go to the hotel forever, because Joanna doesn't want you anymore.
Not the hotel.
I really want to be clear here. The PSP was not a bad handheld, and it certainly was not a failure. There's still a thriving community of people who use their PSPs even to this day. In fact, Ken just made a custom PSP a little while ago that looks dope. It just so happened to be against the absolute juggernaut that was the Nintendo DS. But trust me when I say that the PSP put up a valiant effort. And for that, I salute the PSP. You know, I think this is what it feels like for everyone who's trying to compete with the PS2. You're just, you know, you ever like seen like the video where like, you know, the guy who's a lot taller, has longer reach, puts his hand on the guy's face. You're like this, you're like, I'm trying. And the DS is like, stop. Except it probably didn't sound that cool because the DS was not as cool as the PSP. Well, if it's any consolation, I'm sure that Sony will definitely take the handheld gaming crown next time around, right? Right? I hear the Vita is gonna be great. After a string of wins with the PS1, PS2, and PSP, it's safe to say that Sony were feeling on top of the world. I mean, why not? After a mere 2 generations, PlayStation had absolutely destroyed Sega, embarrassed Nintendo, and handily outperformed the upstart Xbox. Most importantly, gamers were incredibly excited for the next generation. There was a real appetite inside Sony to go bigger and bolder for what would turn into the PlayStation 3. The dawn of the HD era was quickly approaching, and while it wasn't as drastic a leap as the transition from PS1 to PS2, it still presented a significant challenge that's a lot more impressive than the generational upgrades that we see these days. High-definition TVs were just starting to become popular, and Sony had a couple of key pieces of tech in their back pocket. The first was Blu-ray, a Sony-developed successor to the DVD, offering a massive 50 gigabytes of storage capacity, over 5 times that of a DVD. This was crucial for the larger, more detailed HD games that would come to define the PS3 era. But Sony wasn't just interested in a bigger disc. They were also locked in a format war with HD DVD, a cheaper but lower capacity option. Now this was crucial for Sony, as Microsoft was backing HD DVD with the Xbox 360, although the console itself only used DVD. An HD DVD player for 360 was eventually released, but only as an add-on that was a bit of a tough sell. Beyond being able to play high-def video, it didn't really do a lot because no games actually shipped on HD DVD. Regardless, Sony didn't know any of this at the time. For them, the mission was clear. Blu-ray had to win. They were banking hard on the PS3 to replicate the PS2's success in establishing DVD as the standard. With the benefit of hindsight, the choice to commit to Blu-ray was a no-brainer, especially when you consider that 2 generations and 18 years later, it's still the standard not only on PlayStation, but even Xbox today. But back in the mid-2000s, while Microsoft's support for HD DVD posed a threat, Sony was equally focused on the Xbox 360 itself. Even though the original Xbox only saw modest success, and Microsoft lost a lot of money with it, it did have features that Sony couldn't ignore. More powerful hardware, a built-in hard drive, and the excellent online experience of Xbox Live clearly served as benchmarks for Sony during the PS3's development. However, the real changes came from, shall we say, Sony being a little too ambitious when it came to the technical side. Let me introduce to you, my friends, the Cell processor. This was an incredibly bold project by Sony as well as Toshiba and IBM, especially when you compare it to the dual-core CPUs that were common in PCs of the time. The Cell was an 8-core processor. Okay, so that's actually a slight exaggeration, as it actually had 1 classic CPU cores that was paired with 7 SPUs that you could consider to be like baby cores. I mean, I'm simplifying a lot here, but through today's lens, when you really think about it, this is not weird, right? Both the following PS4 as well as the PS5 also utilize 8-core CPUs, as do tons of PCs today. But in 2006, this was completely wild. The Cell processor had the potential for incredible performance in tasks that could be split across multiple cores, such as physics and AI. But the downsides were real. Developers were just starting to design game engines to utilize a couple CPU cores, not a complex network of SPUs, which required serious knowledge to get the most out of. Making matters worse, the heavily multi-core approach meant single-threaded tasks were slower. Think the difference between you and 6 of your friends drinking out of 7 little straws at the same time versus chugging straight from the bottle, but having to do it one at a time. I mean, sure, the multi-strawing is better in theory, but then you need to develop group suction control. All of this resulted in mini games running worse in the beginning on the PS3 than the Xbox 360, with its more conventional, if outright less powerful processor. You know, I probably should explain that one better, but you get the idea, right? Multi-cores, multiple things, but there's only so much suctitude. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say it took quite literally the entire 7-year lifespan of the PS3 for developers like Naughty Dog to really squeeze everything out of the PlayStation with incredible games like The Last of Us. The PS3 was an enormously capable console. It just took a while to get your head around it. Now, the Cell processor's complexity wasn't the only challenge Sony faced, though. The sheer cost of developing it was immense, and the development process itself was filled with delays. This allowed Microsoft to gain a full 1-year head start with the Xbox 360's release in 2005. By the time the PS3 was ready, it was significantly more expensive and complex than its competitor. Now, I think most people know this, but it really is worth reiterating that the PlayStation 3 was eye-wateringly expensive, with the base 20GB model starting at $500 and the 60GB model at $600. Double the PS2's launch price. Now, that base 20GB model lacked a lot of stuff to save the $100, and I'll break down the whole lineup in a minute, but suffice it to say that the 60GB was pretty clearly the real PS3. But $600 was just an astronomical price that's equivalent to like $900 in 2024. Now, the high price and missing features weren't the only challenges that Sony faced. Let's look at the pricing of the Xbox 360. It was much more reasonable, at $300 for the core model and $400 for the Elite. Making matters worse, Sony was estimated to be losing between $200 to $300 on every console they sold. They had undoubtedly built one of the most technically advanced consoles of all time, but at what cost? Oh yeah, the cost of $200 more than its rival. Even for Sony, who were coming off the enormous success of the PS2, this was nothing short of a financial disaster. It's part of the reason I think we've never seen such an ambitious console since, ignoring the piles of money that Sony burned through in the PS3 generation. Something that this chart they recently showed off really makes clear in context. They were onto something here. Funny enough, the first showing of the PS3 was somehow even more ambitious. Not only did it feature HDMI, which was a first for a console, but originally, Sony wanted to ship the PS3 with 2 HDMI ports for multi-monitor support. You know, sometimes I honestly wonder what would have happened if the engineers for the PS3 were really allowed to go wild. Oh wait, no, we don't have to think about that. They would have bankrupted Sony immediately. Now, I'm not sure I can find footage of this, but I remember attending a talk, I think it was GDC or maybe like PlayStation Experience, and Naughty Dog were up on stage, and at the very beginning of the PS4 generation, they were talking about how they had been porting Last of Us, and there was a slide that showed the performance of the CPU on the PS3 was actually higher than on the PS4, at least the theoretical max of what you could get out of the cell. And to me, I think that's a real eye-opener to how far ahead of its time the PS3 was. And I think it's also a big reason why we still don't have official PS3 backwards compatibility today, unlike the Xbox. And also why the community behind RPCS3 had performed minor miracles to get the PS3 emulation up and running, even on today's beefiest gaming PC. I mean, we just don't see huge leaps and risks like this with consoles today. Although, maybe for good reason. The PlayStation 3 launch was, to put it mildly, absolute insanity. After dominating the landscape with the PS2, anticipation for Sony's next-gen console was off the charts. Originally slated for a spring 2006 release, Sony pushed the launch back to November, leaving gamers to dream about what surely would be the most impressive console of all time. Now, console launches have always been hectic, with die-hard fans camping out and limited supplies inevitably leading to shortages. Now, most people think about the Wii in this regard, which of course straight up caused fights around Black Friday. But the PS3 launch? Yeah. So let's start with Japan, where the first PS3s hit shelves just a few days before America in November of '06. In a moment of pure showmanship, good old Ken Kutaragi himself was there to hand over the very first retail units. All 82,000 available consoles sold out in less than 24 hours. But this is where things started to get interesting. The very first buyer of a retail PS3 was arguably a scalper. Now, that's not too unusual by itself, but reports soon emerged that a large portion of the launch line consisted of people who had traveled to Japan just to buy a PS3. Was this just a testament to PlayStation's international appeal? Not quite. It turns out many of these buyers were actually proxies hired by wealthy businessmen. Their mission? Snag those precious PS3s and immediately flip them on eBay for double the price or more. Scalping had evolved, just not in a good way. Now, while that's clearly not great, the US release was somehow even more of a disaster. It was a perfect storm of shortages, scalpers, and unruly crowds, with multiple shootings reported at PS3 launch events. Yes, you heard that right. People were literally risking their lives for a chance to get their hands on Sony's latest gaming machine. Imagine saving $600 to buy a PS3, spending all day in line just to be terrified that someone was going to swipe it from you walking out of the store. Mr. Bolito, do you have a story about this?
So it all starts with my mom being in church.
Okay.
And we had been, at that point, trying to find a PS3 for a month.
This is 2006.
This is 2006, literally in December, like
Yeah.
a month after. I went to the mall with my cousin, and our mall had 3 GameStops. And on the
That's the most 2006 thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Our mall had 3 GameStops.
Yes, and as we were walking to the theater to watch Happy Feet, I was like, why not try to see if they had a PS3? And the third one did. And so I had to call my mom and be like, hey, church can wait. She's like, let me get the communion first. And she showed up not 20 minutes later because the church was down the road. And she was like, okay, we'll do it. And they triple bagged it because this was in the middle of Brooklyn and they were scared we were gonna get robbed.
That's fair, that's fair.
But nonetheless, 60 gig PS3 in hand with a copy of Ricky Bobby included for free.
Hell yeah.
Got my launch PS3.
Yeah, you have a good mom.
Yeah.
My mom would have been like, where's your $600? Despite the chaos, or perhaps because of it, Sony managed to move about 200,000 units in the first 2 weeks after the US launch. Not too bad considering the circumstances. Now, thankfully, the global launch that followed was slightly less eventful, but emphasis on the slightly. In Europe, a few months later, in March of 2007, Sony sold a staggering 600,000 units in just the first 2 days. This made the PS3 the fastest selling home game console in UK history, and the second fastest selling gaming device overall, just behind its portable sibling, the PSP. Interestingly, retailers reported a suspiciously low take rate of games, with some reports pegging only 3 out of every 4 PS3s being sold with a game at all. Why the discrepancy? Well, at the time, standalone Blu-ray players were insanely expensive, oftentimes costing around $1,000. PS3, with its built-in Blu-ray capabilities, suddenly looked like a bargain for movie enthusiasts. Between home theater nerds and scalpers, it's almost like the only people not buying a PS3 at launch were gamers. Well, and people didn't have a large amount of disposable income on hand, which is, most people. Despite the early days looking a lot like the very successful PS2, the PS3 actually sold fewer units at launch than its predecessor. So what happened here? Well, there are a few factors at play. First, let's talk about that 6-month delay. Sony reportedly pushed back the launch due to issues with the Blu-ray copy protection. They probably also appreciated some more time to optimize the cell processor. But the real kicker? A severe lack of supply. Now, Sony did publicly admit that they were having trouble sourcing parts for the Blu-ray disc drive, leading to major hiccups in manufacturing. Initially, Sony planned to have 6 million units ready for the global launch. In reality, they only managed to produce around 2 million. Whoops. This supply issue was particularly problematic because, for the first time, PlayStation was facing some serious competition. Microsoft's Xbox 360 had launched a full year earlier, taking advantage of Sony's delays. Don't forget, it was hundreds of dollars less expensive, which meant that by the time the PS3 hit shelves, the 360 already had 1.4 million units in the hands of gamers, and tens of millions of people were just sitting on the fence to see if the PlayStation 3 was actually going to be worth it. Let me just take this off real quick. So this, my friends, is an original 60GB launch PS3. And as we'll discuss later, it is clearly the best one. Now we'll be playing some Gran Turismo 6, which admittedly is a game that came out significantly after the launch, but I think it does a good job of showing just what kind of potential the PS3 really had. Actually, if I recall correctly, Gran Turismo 6 was one of the games that pretty heavily leaned on the hard drive as well as the Blu-ray drive. And that's actually one of the things that most, especially later model PS3 games, really leaned on everything that they could get. Because one of the main issues with the PS3 is that even though the Blu-ray drive had tons of capacity, right? You could go up to 50 gigabytes for a game, but it was really slow, which meant that if you're loading 50 gigabytes of data off your Blu-ray, your load time's gonna be real slow. I'll say that while this game certainly looks quite a bit more low res compared to something like Gran Turismo 7, but considering that there's 2 generations between the two, I would argue this actually is pretty solid. Now, if I can actually say anything negative about the PS3, it's actually the controller. So there's a bit of a backstory there. It's kind of long and convoluted, but basically there were 2 major versions of the PlayStation 3 controller. There was the 6-axis, which is what was launched with the PS3, and then there was the DualShock 3. The only real difference between them was just the fact that the 6-axis, the original launch controller, did not have any vibration, and this is a 6-axis, unfortunately, which means that I got no vibration. It's fine, I think a lot of people liked it, but this was definitely the generation where the Xbox had a far better controller. I still think the Xbox 360 controller runs rings around this one. Okay, I was only 13 seconds behind. You know, it's funny, if you go back and play a PS3 after, playing more modern consoles like a PS5 or something, the things that jump out to me really are the controllers and the load times, because the graphics, honestly, are not that bad. The ambitious technology packed into the PS3 came at a steep cost, both for Sony and for gamers. The company almost immediately began looking for ways to cut costs and bring the PS3's incredibly high price tag down to a more reasonable level. The launch model, retrospectively dubbed the 60 gig version, was a technological powerhouse, and it's not even arguable. It was the best PS3 ever made. It featured full hardware backwards compatibility with PS2 games, thanks to the inclusion of the Emotion engine from the PS2. It also boasted Wi-Fi, a card reader, and 4 USB ports. This was the premium experience that Sony had promised, but it came at a premium price. Sony also offered the 20 gigabyte model. This version ditched the card reader, cut the USB ports down to 2, and most significantly, removed Wi-Fi. The goal was clear: offer a slightly cheaper option to boost adoption. But Sony wasn't done cost cutting. Throughout 2007, they released a few more cut down versions, including an 80 gigabyte model, which, while it had a bigger drive, entirely removed the hardware backwards compatibility for PS2 games and cost the same $600 as the launch model. Then in late 2007, they made a major revision, including a new base model 40 gigabyte version. This trimmed all the remaining fat, including backwards compatibility altogether, the card readers, and they moved the cell processor to a newer, more efficient 65nm process that was cheaper to make. These changes did allow Sony to lower the price further to $399, somewhat more competitive with the Xbox 360, but at the cost of a console that a mere year into its life was losing features that many considered essential to the PS3 experience. The PS2 back compat was definitely the big one. These cut-down PS3s were the first PlayStation home consoles ever to lose backwards compatibility. I think it's safe to say that this was not normal, and especially with the benefit of hindsight, it makes it clear just how overly ambitious the plans for the PS3 were, causing massive headaches for Sony as they tried to wrestle the PlayStation 3 into a position of, not losing them truckloads of money every month. Throughout 2008 and 2009, Sony continued to tweak the formula, releasing 80 gigabyte and later 160 gigabyte versions. Now these were pretty straightforward changes, mostly maintaining the reduced feature set of the 40 gigabyte version, but with a bit more storage. While gamers were slowly getting on board with these changing PS3 models, some unexpected groups found some interesting uses for Sony's most powerful console. The raw performance of the cell processor caught the attention of some universities and research institutions who began buying PS3s en masse, networking them together to create makeshift supercomputers. The most notable example, the US Air Force. In 2010, they put together 1,760 PS3s to create a system used for radar enhancement and AI research. Now, why go through all of this trouble? Well, it came down to cost. Game consoles are typically sold at a loss, as we've especially established in the case of the PS3, with manufacturers making their money back on game sales later on. For the Air Force's purposes, $400 per compute unit was an absolute steal. Comparable specialized hardware cost around $10,000 per unit. The fact that the cell processor could run Linux made it a breeze to use for custom programs. This brings us to a controversial chapter in the PS3's history. Originally, Sony proudly touted the PS3's ability to run Linux as a key feature, as they did with the PS2 before. It allowed tech-savvy users to turn their consoles into fully functional computers. However, in 2010, Sony abruptly removed this capability via a firmware update. Now this was different from the updated models of the PS3 that slowly removed features to save money. One day you woke up and your PS3 wanted to download an update that straight up removed a major feature. The backlash, I probably don't need to tell you, was swift. Users felt betrayed, especially those who had purchased the PS3 specifically for its Linux support. A class action lawsuit was filed, claiming that Sony had engaged in deceptive marketing. After years of legal battles, Sony eventually settled, agreeing to pay a meager $3.75 million to the affected users. That's probably like, what, 25 cents per person or whatever? But even the removal of Linux support was far from the biggest issue plaguing PS3 owners. A couple of years into the console's life cycle, reports began to surface of a mysterious and dreaded malfunction, the yellow light of death. Picture this. You sit down for a gaming session, hit the power button on your PS3, and instead of the comforting blue light, you're greeted with an ominous yellow flash. Your heart sinks as you realize your console is now little more than an expensive paperweight. The yellow light of death, or the YLOD, became notorious among PS3 owners. It typically struck around the 2-year mark, conveniently after Sony's 1-year warranty had expired. Now, the exact cause was debated for years, but it's now generally understood to be related to overheating. The high temperatures inside the console could cause solder points on the motherboard to crack, leading to failures in critical components like the GPU. Now, it is important to put this issue into perspective. While it seemed like the yellow light was running rampant, in reality only a small percentage of all PS3s were affected. Now that's still thousands of consoles, to be sure, and absolutely devastating if you were one of the unlucky ones. But it pales in comparison to the infamous red ring of death that plagued the Xbox 360. Some sources estimate that up to 50% of launch model 360s were affected.
I actually had 2 PS3 FATs fail on me. The first time, Sony just completely replaced it.
Was it under warranty or was it outside?
No, it was outside of warranty, but they did it anyway.
Wow, okay.
And then the second time, they gave me the option of a free replacement FAT, or I could pay $100 and get a slim 120 gig.
Nice.
And I chose the 120 gig because why not? At that point, I didn't need the back compat. I'm still, in fact, using that PS3 today.
Look at Ken, over here with all the PS3 stories I could ever hope for. I, unfortunately, didn't own a PS3 because I was poor.
And now you own like 50 of them.
Joke's on you, life. Still, the yellow light of death became a black mark on the PS3's reputation. It fueled the narrative that Sony had rushed out an overly complex, unreliable console to market. Combined with the high price tag and initial lack of must-have games, it all contributed to the PlayStation 3's properly rocky start in the console war against Microsoft's Xbox 360. The launch of the PlayStation 3 Slim in 2009 marked a crucial turning point for Sony's struggling console. After years of grappling with high production costs, hardware issues, and lackluster sales compared to its predecessor, the Slim model addressed nearly all of the original PS3 shortcomings. First, it sported a sleek new design. Gone was the bulky, scratch-prone original PS3. The Slim lived up to its name, with a more compact, streamlined look. Now, Sony also took this opportunity to rebrand, ditching the Spider-Man font for a cleaner, more modern logo. In my opinion, it's the best looking PS3 ever by far. It also had significantly better reliability. Sony had thankfully learned from the yellow light of death fiasco. It also ran significantly quieter than the notoriously loud original PlayStation 3, largely thanks to the Slim's improved power efficiency. Perhaps the most significant change, though, was the price. The PS3 Slim launched at a much more affordable $299, a far cry from the original's $600 price tag. Now, the only real downside to the Slim was the complete lack of backwards compatibility when it came to PS2 games. However, since later models of the fat PS3 had already ditched this feature, to be honest, most people were kind of over it. The response to the PS3 Slim was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Within 24 hours of its release, it became the best-selling gaming console on the market. This success came at a crucial time in the console war with the 360. While Sony had been struggling to gain traction, Microsoft had been steadily building its user base since its earlier launch in 2005. This was firstly driven by its strong launch lineup and exclusive titles. Games like Halo 3 and Gears of War were system sellers. Xbox Live was also miles ahead of Sony's PlayStation Network at the time, offering a more seamless multiplayer experience. Now, part of that is to be expected. Microsoft were on their second generation of Xbox Live, and you had to pay a pretty significant $60 per year for Xbox Live Gold, where Sony always kept PSN free on the PS3. You know, referring back to the whole, the PlayStation 3 generation keeps losing money for Sony, I don't know why. You know, that thing. But it wasn't just the fact that Xbox Live was paid. Microsoft really emphasized the social aspects of gaming, positioning the Xbox 360 as a platform for connecting with friends. There were advantages for PSN though, namely the fact that it was free to play really lowered the barrier to entry to playing with your friends, although it was clearly less reliable, with multi-platform titles like Call of Duty offering better latency and a more stable experience on Xbox Live. However, in April of 2011, Sony faced a catastrophic security breach that would threaten to derail the PS3's momentum entirely.
Sony has confirmed that hackers broke into its PlayStation network, exposing the personal information of up to 77 million users worldwide.
Hackers infiltrated the PSN, compromising the personal and financial information of approximately 77 million user accounts. This massive data breach forced Sony to shut down the entire PSN for an unprecedented 23 days, leaving millions of PS3 and PSP users unable to access online gaming or digital purchases. Just talk to anyone who worked at Sony during this time and watch their face. Dark times, man. Jeesh. The incident not only highlighted the vulnerabilities in Sony's network infrastructure, but also dealt a severe blow to gamers' trust. In the aftermath, Sony did offer users identity theft protection and a welcome back package of free games, but the damage to their reputation was significant. However, the 360 was of course not without its own problems. Lots of gamers were steering clear after the Red Ring of Death fiasco, and Microsoft was forced to set aside billions of dollars to extend the warranty and deliver replacements, all in the hope the gamers could be won back. And you know, they largely were, just at a hefty cost. Now, it's also worth noting that while Sony and Microsoft were duking it out in the traditional console space, Nintendo was very much off doing its own thing with the incredibly successful Wii. The motion control-based console really appealed to a broader, more casual audience, and it became a surprise hit. However, its lack of HD graphics and less powerful hardware meant that it really wasn't competing with the PS3 and the Xbox 360 for the core gamer market. In 2012, the landscape was almost unrecognizable compared to 2006 when the PS3 launched. The original PS3's complex architecture, centered around the Cell processor, had been notoriously difficult to develop for. Many multi-platform games initially performed better on the Xbox 360, simply because developers found it easier to optimize for Microsoft's hardware. However, as the generation progressed and developers became more familiar with the PS3's quirks, this gap did begin to close. By the latter half of the generation, many multi-platform titles were reaching parity across both systems, and some PS3 exclusives, such as Uncharted and The Last of Us, pushed the boundaries of what was possible on console hardware. And so when Sony revealed the final hardware revision, later known as the Super Slim in September of 2012, it was the final form of the PS3 in more ways than one. The cost cutting at this point had claimed everything. Of course, there was no PS2 back compat or Linux support, but it also had a new, even slimmer design that dropped the slot loading disc tray in favor of the cheapest sliding door, probably of all time. Find me a cheaper door. They even dropped the hard drive from the base model, instead shipping it with 12 gigabytes of flash storage, so you know, the operating system functioned, but if you actually wanted to do anything with it, you pretty much had to go out and buy a hard drive yourself. Or I guess you could limit yourself to games that didn't need any extra space, which by the time 2012 rolled around, were incredibly few and far between. Now look, I'm biased here, but I've always really disliked the Super Slim for being so absolutely cut down and cheap that it's hardly recognizable from the beastly original PS3. But this was a key reason why Sony were able to really crank up the sales in the last few years of the PlayStation 3. And this, paired with huge games released right at the end of the life cycle, such as GTA 5 and The Last of Us, meant that, miraculously, Sony barely outsold the Xbox 360 when it was all said and done. Boy, this has been the episode I've been most excited for ever since we first started making this series. There has never, and will likely never be, another generation that's just this insane. Sony came in with all the confidence in the world after dominating generation after generation. They developed an absurdly complex and ahead of its time console, which single-handedly forced Blu-ray to 2 decades of success and birthed some of the most important games of all time. And yet, it kind of failed. From a sales perspective, Sony lost billions on the PS3, and while it's debatable, I think history has shown that both the Wii and the Xbox 360s were the real winners of the generation. The Wii cemented Nintendo's pivot from competing with Sony and Microsoft to really just doing their own thing to pretty great success. Well, as long as you don't count the Wii U, I guess. And there is no doubt that the Xbox 360 was the greatest generation of Xbox ever. A high watermark that, if I'm honest, they're probably never going to top. So, how does history look back on the PlayStation 3? It was an enormously bold bet that kind of blew up in Sony's face and forced them to play on defense the entire generation. And as we'll talk about when we get to the PS4, it caused a huge shift in the way that future generations would be handled. It's no secret that I loved the PSP. As Sony's first foray into the handheld market, it was the underdog that dared to challenge Nintendo's iron grip on portable gaming with the Game Boy and later the DS. While it didn't quite dethrone the handheld king, the PSP carved out its own passionate fan base and left a real mark as the console for hardcore gamers. However, a looming threat was already on the horizon. By 2008, the world was evolving quickly. Apple had just released the first iPhone and later the App Store, and Google were preparing to launch Android, both of which were a new and arguably more convenient way of playing on the go without needing a dedicated handheld. So when it came time to develop the sequel to the beloved PSP, the PlayStation team had to make a crucial decision. Would they build a true successor, or should they lean into something entirely new to compete with the upcoming smartphones? In the end, they chose to hedge their bets and do both. The Sony Xperia Play, aka the PlayStation phone, brought an almost PSP Go-like form factor with slide-out physical controls paired with a full-fledged Android phone. It ran PS1 games along with some exclusive titles, like bringing Minecraft to mobile for the first time. Funny, I feel like that game's got some potential. You know, here's the thing. I did a video on the Xperia Play when it came out, and I remember trying Minecraft on mobile. I'm like, wow, you could play this Minecraft game on an Android phone? What? Crazy! What will technology bring next? Minecraft still looks the same, actually. I don't think it's the same. Meanwhile, the core PlayStation team stayed the course to build the true successor to the PSP. Excitement for the next generation was quickly reaching a fever pitch. After years of speculation, in January of 2011, Sony was finally ready to show their hand. At a press conference in Tokyo, then CEO Kaz Hirai took the stage to unveil what they were calling the Next Generation Portable, or NGP. The reveal was met with excitement and a fair bit of skepticism. Sony was promising a device that could deliver near PS3 quality graphics in the palm of your hand, a claim that seemed a little too good to be true.
But they're able to really enjoy that particular console for a very long time.
That's definitely true, just maybe not the way he thought. To underscore just how serious they were about the NGP, Sony brought in some serious talent to spearhead its development. Mark Cerny. While you might know him today as the lead architect behind the PlayStation 4 and 5, Cerny is one of the godfathers of the gaming industry. He cut his teeth at Atari and Sega, breathed life into Crash Bandicoot and Naughty Dog, and helped shape franchises such as Ratchet and Clank as well as Jak and Daxter. At the heart of the NGP, which of course was basically identical to the final shipping PS Vita, was a custom-designed system on a chip that pushed the boundaries of mobile gaming hardware at the time. With a quad-core ARM-based CPU and beefy PowerVR GPU, there was a lot of power on tap. Memory was also a strong point for the Vita. It boasted 512 megabytes of RAM and an additional 128 megabytes of VRAM, which was a massive upgrade over the PSP's mere 32 megabytes. The centerpiece of the Vita's hardware was its stunning 5-inch OLED display. With a resolution of 960 by 544, it delivered vibrant colors and deep blacks that really made games pop and absolutely embarrassed the mediocre display on the 3DS. It was also a capacitive touchscreen, meaning no need for a stylus, and in a unique twist, the Vita also featured a rear touchpad, which was neat if not very often used by most games. For connectivity, the Vita included Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and uniquely optional full 3G cellular. It won't be a surprise to learn that this was not a commonly chosen option, and it got phased out of the Vita lineup pretty quickly. Then there were the quality of life upgrades, such as dual front and rear facing cameras, and dual analog sticks that finally had arrived. Honestly, it's probably the biggest single upgrade for the PSP in my opinion, especially when it comes to shooting games. Trying to use the little tiny PSP nubbin and nothing else, it's not fun. I mean, technically you use the D-pad, but like, no, that was not it. Compared to its main competitor, the 3DS, the Vita was packing some serious firepower. In raw performance, it was estimated to be about 2 to 3 times more powerful than the 3DS, and that was with Sony being conservative. Engineers could have pushed it much farther, but they were worried about two things: heat and battery life. Quote, "Well, it's not going to run at 2 gigahertz like the PS3, because the battery would last 5 minutes and would probably set fire to your pants," according to an engineer who probably got in trouble for saying that. But it was true. Even with this more conservative route, the Vita was still head and shoulders ahead of the competition. To demonstrate the console's capabilities, Sony showcased a portable version of their hit franchise, Uncharted. The game, later titled Uncharted Golden Abyss, looked remarkably close to its PS3 counterparts. It was a clear statement. Good luck running a PS3 quality game on your wimpy smartphone. Angry Birds? How about angry that you ain't got that Vita energy, boy? This is the Vita sign, right?
No gang signs, please.
No, all right. No access, no gang signs. Alex, can I have any fun ever? Jeez. However, the reveal wasn't without its concerns. The impressive tech specs led many to worry about the potential price point and, of course, battery life. Sony remained tight-lipped on these details, leading to speculation that the device might be prohibitively expensive. Just imagine Sony releasing an ambitious and incredibly expensive console. Like, they would never, ever do something like that. Oh yeah. At E3 2011, they officially rebranded the NGP as the PlayStation Vita. Vita meaning life in Latin. The name was chosen to emphasize Sony's vision of the device as an integral part of a gamer's lifestyle. Although, and maybe it's just me, it feels so out of place in the history of PlayStation. We've got PS1, PS2, PS3, PSP, Vita, PS4, PS5, like, it just doesn't roll off the tongue. As the Vita's late 2011 launch date approached, anticipation continued to build, but Sony were facing big challenges. The devastating earthquake and tsunami in March of 2011 had disrupted supply chains across Japan. And of course, the massive security breach of the PlayStation Network in April of 2011 had damaged Sony's reputation and probably diverted some resources away from the Vita's development.
Real greatness, it's what you do with the hand you dealt.
Despite these setbacks, Sony pushed forward, determining to deliver on their promises of the next generation of handheld gaming. The stage was well and truly set. The PlayStation Vita's launch was a moment of both triumph and probably a lot of stress for Sony. After years of development and hype, the Vita finally hit store shelves in Japan on December 17, 2011. The initial response seemed promising. Over 300,000 units sold in the first week alone. It was a solid start, outpacing the launch of its predecessor, the PSP. But the real test came with the global launch in February of 2012. In North America, the Vita sold more than 200,000 units in its first month. Now, on paper, these numbers looked really good, but the reality was more complex. The Vita was entering a very different market than the PSP did. Thankfully, the launch lineup was pretty solid, boasting 26 titles that showcased the device's capabilities. Games like Uncharted Golden Abyss, Wipeout 2048, and Rayman Origins demonstrated that the PS Vita could actually deliver console-quality gaming on the go. Now yes, maybe it wasn't quite on the level of the PS3, but it was impressive, and the variety of the games were there too, from big-budget action games all the way to quirky indie titles. However, the elephant in the room was the price. At $249 for the Wi-Fi model and $299 for the 3G version, the Vita was positioning itself as a premium device. This was a risky move, especially considering that Nintendo had recently slashed the price of its 3DS handheld from $250 to $170 after a rocky start. Equally as problematic were the proprietary memory cards. If you wanted to download games or even save your progress on many titles, you needed one of Sony's expensive Vita memory cards. These ranged from $20 for a measly 4 gigabytes to an eye-watering $120 for 32 gigs. It was a decision that would haunt the Vita throughout its lifespan, turning many potential buyers away. But as they say, never ever ever let Sony make proprietary media, because they're going to milk it and make you buy it, and it's going to be really expensive, and it's not going to be as good as like an SD card or literally anything else, because you know, I probably could have sent my children to college instead of buying all the PS Vita memory cards. That would have been a better idea. Actually, no, to be fair, it has been years, but we actually can finally buy those like microSD adapters for the PS Vita memory cards. Highly recommend to get one of those, and don't buy one of the incredibly rare and expensive Vita memory cards in 2024. Despite these challenges, there was genuine excitement around the Vita's launch. Tech reviewers praised the device's gorgeous OLED screen, comfortable controls, and impressive horsepower. For gamers who had dreamed of console-quality gaming on the go, the Vita seemed to deliver on its promises. But as the weeks turned into months, cracks began to show in Sony's strategy. After the initial surge of launch sales, demand began to cool. By spring, the Vita was selling only around 12,000 units a week in Japan and 50,000 a month in North America, numbers that were concerning for a brand new system. The competition wasn't making things any easier. Nintendo's 3DS, after its price cut at least, had found its footing and was beginning to build momentum. Popular franchises like Mario Kart 7 and Super Mario 3D Land were driving sales, and the 3DS's lower price point made it an easier sell to parents and casual gamers. The biggest issue though was absolutely the rise of smartphone gaming. It simply was eating into the market for dedicated handhelds. Why carry a separate device when you can play games on the phone you already have in your pocket? So we'll say that playing the Vita even today is still a really nice experience, especially when it comes to games such as Tearaway. Now this was not a launch title, I don't think, but Tearaway is always the game I think about with the Vita that's most Vita-y. You know, it has all of the features that the Vita had. So you've got touch controls, you've also got the rear touch controls for certain parts. You also can just rotate around and take your own photos in the game. Like, Tearaway I think does a lot that was very much like, hey, let's show off what the Vita can do. It almost reminds me in some ways of Astro's Playroom, except that it was a paid $40 game. But it's lovely, and it looks really nice too. Oh, I need to touch, right? No, touch on the back. It's that fingerprint. What do I need to do? Oh, there we go. I had to push it over. Man, this just feels great because there's so many quality of life upgrades over the PSP. You've got yourself the dual analog sticks, which this game doesn't really take advantage of, but most games do. You've got that beautiful OLED touchscreen. You've got the fact that it actually feels nice. You've also got the little like dimples on the back of the PS Vita, which feel nice. Like, yeah, could you make the argument that it's a little bit small for today? Yeah, but it doesn't really feel all that different than playing with your smartphone and a controller, right? Like, this is a very reasonable size, especially in a world where we're all playing on like Steam Decks or Legion Go's that are massive. This feels a lot more reasonable. Yeet. No, that's not it. Oh, I get it. Turns on the stairs. There we go. But the issue here was that even the Vita had a lot of issues with games. Not only did it not have an enormous selection, but on top of that, you gotta remember, this is back when games were mobile versions on handhelds such as the Vita, right? Like today, if you buy Hogwarts Legacy on the Switch, is it gonna look worse? Absolutely, but it's still the same game, right? But with this, unless you're playing a game such as Tearaway that was designed specifically for the Vita, games that were very few and far between, the vast majority of games that you would buy, whether it be a Call of Duty or a Madden or whatever, were definitely weaker versions of the games, and the ultimate thing that was a problem was that a lot of smartphones also got very similar versions of games. In fact, this was in the era where you could play stuff like Dead Space on your iPhone, which felt like it was the future. And the Vita, well, the Vita just couldn't. Or at least, it didn't. The early years of the PlayStation Vita were a roller coaster of highs and lows. On the software front, the Vita did keep up some momentum. 2012 saw the release of several high-profile titles that showcased what the Vita could do, including Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation, Little Big Planet, and probably most notably, Persona 4 Golden, which quickly became a system seller and remains one of the most beloved games in the Vita's library. However, not every big release hit the mark. Call of Duty Black Ops Declassified, a game that many hoped would drive adoption among hardcore gamers, landed with, well, at least it wasn't Modern Warfare 3 on the DS. With a Metacritic score of just 33%, Declassified became one of the worst reviewed games in the franchise's history. Despite some signs of life, hardware sales were really starting to ring alarm bells now. By the end of 2012, Sony reported that the Vita had only sold 4 million units worldwide. This number paled in comparison to the Nintendo 3DS, which had sold over 17 million units in roughly the same time frame. Even more worryingly, this would be the last time that Sony publicly disclosed Vita's sales figures, a move that many interpreted as an attempt to save face. In early 2013, the company announced the first price cut for the handheld, dropping it from $250 to $200. This was a necessary move to stay competitive, but it also ate into Sony's already questionable profit margins. 2013 also saw the launch of the PlayStation 4. The ability to use the Vita as a second screen for the PS4, or to stream PS4 games to the handheld, a feature you might be familiar with called Remote Play, gave the Vita a new lease on life for some gamers. This wasn't exactly a new concept, mind you. The PSP did have some limited remote play capabilities, but the implementation on the PS4 was a lot more usable. Yet even as Sony tried to find new ways to make the Vita relevant, they faced a growing problem. Third-party developers were beginning to abandon the platform. The install base just simply wasn't large enough to justify the investment for many AAA games, when developers could instead target the 3DS, or in most cases, the truly enormous iPhone and Android ecosystems. Worse still, even Sony began to lose focus on the Vita, with the brand new shiny PS4 tearing up the sales charts. The actual support for first-party titles on the Vita was winding down just about as quickly as the Vita had even gotten started. In response to this challenge, Sony made a strategic pivot. Rather than continuing to chase after big-budget titles, they began to court indie developers. Sony even waived developer fees, making it easier than ever for small teams to publish on the platform. This indie-friendly approach really led to what many would consider to be a renaissance for the Vita. Games like Hotline Miami, Spelunky, and Fez found a perfect home on the handheld. The Vita began to carve out a niche as the ultimate indie game machine, appealing to players who wanted unique and innovative experiences on the go. As the Vita struggled to gain traction in the market, Sony pulled out their tried and true playbook. Bring out a slim model that removes a bunch of features that people actually care about. The most noticeable change was in the form factor itself. True to its slim name, it was about 20% thinner and about 15% lighter. However, the most controversial change came with the display. Sony replaced the original OLED screen with an LCD panel. Now, while this was primarily a cost-cutting measure, and I absolutely preferred the OLED to the LCD, it was at least a pretty decent screen. The LCD offered accurate color reproduction and better visibility in bright light, although it of course lacked the OLED's excellent contrast ratio. Battery life also saw an improvement in the slim model. Through a combination of the more efficient LCD screen, refined internal components, and a slightly larger battery, users could expect around an extra hour of gameplay compared to the original model. Another notable inclusion was 1 GB of internal storage. Now, that might seem paltry by today's standards. It was a significant improvement over the original model, which had no built-in storage at all. This meant that users could save game data and even download some very small games without having to purchase a separate memory card, at least right away. Speaking of memory cards, Sony also made some adjustments in this area. The proprietary Vita memory cards, which had been a small point of contention, mostly due to the fact that they cost roughly as much as Snake Venom, Liquid Gold, or printer ink, they finally saw some price reductions. The 4 GB card dropped by about $5, while the larger capacity cards saw discounts of $15 to $20. Better than nothing, I guess? Although it was not better than the SD or micro SD that the 3DS used, which was, cheap. In addition to the slim model, Sony introduced another piece of hardware, the PlayStation TV. Now, this wasn't a handheld device. Instead, it basically dropped the Vita motherboard in a small set-top box that paired to an included DualShock 3, so you could play most Vita games on a TV. Now, priced at a relatively affordable $100, it was an interesting concept, but it did struggle to find its audience. It launched to modest sales in Japan, with only around 42,000 units sold in its debut week. Global sales figures were never officially released, but estimates suggest that it probably didn't even reach 1 million units sold worldwide. I remember there was a time where these things were on sale all day long for $40, maybe $50, until the stock finally dried up years later. And as soon as the stock dried up, they shot up, and now they're worth like, I don't know, $150, $200? It was a neat idea, but I think the time for micro consoles has sadly come and gone. The PlayStation Vita's journey may have been less than smooth, but its impact on the gaming industry is undeniable, and there's real argument that it was the right console, just at the wrong time. By 2018, which is also wild to think about that they still made the Vita 2 years into the lifespan of the Switch, Sony had officially discontinued the Vita, with final sales estimates hovering around 15 to 16 million units. To put that in perspective, it's roughly on par with the Wii U, and by far the worst selling PlayStation console ever, even to this day. Certainly not the numbers that Sony had hoped for when they set out to replace the PSP. And yet, sales figures, they only tell part of the story. As usual, PlayStation's questionable marketing practices did not help matters. They were sued for misleading ads. Early PS Vita ads heavily pushed the system's remote play, cross-platform, and cross-save features, which, while great in theory, were very limited in practice, available on only a handful of games, and some even required you to buy 2 copies of the same game, the PS3 version as well as the Vita version. Their sexist ads definitely didn't help either.
You can keep going all day long. Don't you like that?
I'm not even gonna make you watch all of them. I hadn't even seen some of these until we started doing the research for this video, and Yikes. I don't know what is wrong with the Sony marketing teams, but they were on one for a couple decades there. Questionable ads aside, the Vita definitely did find a dedicated niche, especially in Japan, where they continued to use the system long after most gamers had moved on. It became the go-to platform for JRPGs and visual novels, titles that might not have found a home elsewhere. Perhaps even more significant is the Vita's impact on the modding and homebrew community. Long after official support ended, enthusiasts have continued to push the boundaries of what the system can do. For years, it was considered one of the best ways to emulate classic games, thanks to its vibrant OLED screen and actually good controls. The Vita's influence can be felt even today. The Nintendo Switch really was the spiritual successor, with its focus on both big budget and indie titles. It's clear that Nintendo learned from both the successes and the failures of the Vita. Now, I firmly believe that the PS Vita was everything that gamers could have hoped for from a PSP2. It doesn't take a great amount of imagination to draw a line directly from the last portable PlayStation to devices of today like the Steam Deck. In many ways, the Vita was a handheld ahead of its time, pushing boundaries that the market just wasn't quite ready for. Looking toward the future, it does seem like the time is perfect for Sony to bring out a properly next-generation portable console. Between the bizarre success of the PlayStation Portal, the enormous sales figures of the Switch, and the quickly growing PC handheld space, you can't tell me that a portable PS6 wouldn't absolutely crush it. But I guess I've been wrong before. The PlayStation 4 is fascinating. Not just because it's one of the most successful gaming consoles ever made, although with over 117 million units sold, it definitely is. One of the things that makes the PS4 unique is how it completely transformed PlayStation's approach to console design. After the ambitious but nearly disastrous PS3, Sony, well, they kind of had to rethink everything. But also, for me, the PS4, it holds a little bit more of a personal attachment. This was the first generation that I was able to cover from start to finish. From being in the room for that legendary E3 announcement, to getting my hands on the DualShock 4 early, all the way through to buying one of the very last PS4s ever made. To understand the PS4, we really need to talk about the elephant in the room, the PlayStation 3. Now technically, Sony could claim that they outsold the Xbox 360, but it was by the absolute thinnest of margins and at tremendous cost. Picture this, Sony had just come off the PS2, arguably the most dominant console ever made. Then they brought out the PS3, a powerful but unbelievably complicated console that they also happened to price at $599, or about $900 accounting for inflation. By the end of the generation in 2013, the damage was staggering. Sony had burned through hundreds of millions, billions of dollars selling consoles at a massive loss. The whole of Sony was kind of approaching a crisis. We're talking about credit rating downgrades, layoffs, and having to sell off their iconic Manhattan headquarters. And it wasn't just the PS3 either. The PlayStation Vita, which was supposed to be Sony's answer to Nintendo's 3DS, was struggling to find its footing. While it certainly wasn't officially dead yet, sales were so disappointing that major retailers were already starting to scale back support. Inside Sony, there was some real soul-searching going on. The old PlayStation playbook of throwing massive amounts of money at bleeding-edge technology had backfired kind of spectacularly. Now if you ask me, the question at this point wasn't, how do we make the PS4 more successful? It was much more so, how do we not f up again this badly? Now this context is crucial because it shaped every decision Sony made with the PS4. They needed a win, and they needed it without betting the company. In a way, Sony's overconfidence with the PS3 ended up being the best thing that could have happened to the PS4 because it really forced them to completely rethink their approach. They couldn't just coast on being the most dominant console because suddenly, Sony were kind of the underdogs, and it was on them to take the crown back. If you want to understand just how differently Sony approached the PS4, look no further than who was leading the charge. Ken Kutaragi, the father of PlayStation, had been the driving force behind every PlayStation up to this point. His philosophy? Push the absolute boundaries of what was possible. Screw what it cost or how hard it would be to pull off. This is the guy who started developing the PS2 before Sony even approved it, and the guy who championed the revolutionary but fiendishly complicated cell processor in the PS3. But for the PS4, the reins were handed to Mark Cerny. Now Cerny wasn't exactly new to PlayStation. He'd been involved since the PS1 days, working on games like Crash Bandicoot, and he helped to architect the PS Vita. But his approach couldn't have been much more different. Where Kutaragi-san was all about revolutionary tech and pushing boundaries, Cerny focused on evolution and practicality. Gone was the hubris of, we know best and you're gonna develop for our console and you're gonna like it, damn it. And instead was a more humble, much more collaborative mentality. The idea that Cerny was actively engaging with developers, understanding their frustrations with the PS3, and figuring out what they actually needed in next-gen hardware proved to be an incredibly important part of this generation. You know what's fascinating about the PS4? From a pure technology perspective, it might just be the least ambitious PlayStation ever made. Now, I know that sounds bizarre given how successful it was, but hear me out. Look at PlayStation's history. The PS1 revolutionized 3D gaming and brought CD-ROM to the masses. The PS2 basically made DVD mainstream while pushing what was possible with games. The PS3? That thing was so powerful, the US military bought thousands of them to build supercomputers. Even the PSP and Vita tried, to varying levels of success, to bring console-quality gaming to handhelds. PS4? It was, well, basically just a really good PC in a box. That's kind of exactly why it worked. No more exotic processors and custom architectures that developers needed years to figure out. No more bleeding-edge technology that cost a fortune to manufacture. Sony looked at what worked, specifically what worked in gaming PCs, and just kind of made that. A brand new partnership with AMD for the PS4 really shows this shift in thinking. Instead of another super complex cell processor, Sony went with what's called an APU, basically combining both the CPU and graphics into a single chip. The graphics side was legitimately pretty solid for 2013. AMD's GCN architecture was pretty much the best you could get at the time. Importantly, Sony opted for a beefier GPU than what Microsoft put in the Xbox One, which might just come up a little bit later. The CPU side was, shall we say, a bit more modest. Sure, having 8 cores sounds impressive, when at the time most PCs only had 4, but these were AMD's wimpy Jaguar cores, which originally meant for budget laptops. But since Sony had committed to going with AMD, it simply was a trade-off that they had to live with. Now there was one much more major trade-off though. Backwards compatibility was completely off the table. The PS4's totally different architecture meant it couldn't run PS3 games at all, and Sony didn't even try to support PS1 or PS2 games like earlier PlayStations had. Although, yes, technically toward the end of the PS4 lifecycle, they did release a couple of PS2 classics, but like, my point stands. But you know what? These compromises, they, I would argue, were ultimately what Sony needed. The PS3 was powerful but difficult to develop for. In stark contrast, working with the PS4 was far easier than not only the PS3, but even a lot of gaming PCs. In February 2013, Sony revealed the PlayStation 4 at an event in New York City. Now the gaming world was in a very different place than it was back when the PS3 had launched. Mobile gaming was exploding, Nintendo had stumbled out of the gate with the Wii U, and Microsoft was about to, well, we'll get to that disaster in a minute. The reveal itself though was fascinating. Instead of leading with raw specs or trying to pitch the PS4 as a multimedia powerhouse like the PS3 was, Sony focused almost entirely on games and the experience of playing them. They showed off next-gen titles like Killzone Shadowfall and Watch Dogs that definitely looked like a solid step up from the PS3. But for me, the real star of the show wasn't graphics or frame rates, it was the controller. Now this might sound strange to anyone who wasn't around for the PS3 era, but you've got to understand, Sony had basically been shipping the same controller since 1994. Now, sure, they had added analog sticks and rumble and even that weird 6-axis motion control, but like, at its core, the design hadn't really evolved. Meanwhile, Microsoft had absolutely nailed it with the Xbox 360 controller, to the point where even die-hard PlayStation fans would often admit that it was just a straight-up better controller. Sony knew they needed more than just better graphics this time around. That's where an unlikely partnership came in. They tapped Bungie, the creators of Halo, to help design the DualShock 4. The result was the biggest redesign in PlayStation controller history. The DualShock 4 wasn't just an evolution, it really was a complete rethink. The grips were longer and more ergonomic, the triggers were actually curved for your fingers, and the analog sticks finally had a proper concave design. Even the touchpad, which sure, maybe it wasn't revolutionary for gaming, showed that Sony was willing to break from tradition. At least in my opinion, it was a straight up better controller in every possible way. E3 2013 wasn't just another gaming conference. It was the day that basically determined the entire console generation before a single system was even sold. And your boy Austin had a front row seat. Now, this was my first E3, and let me tell you, the energy was wild. So back then, all of the major announcements happened on a single day. So in the morning, there was the Microsoft Xbox showcase, and for context, they had already stumbled with the initial Xbox One reveal, which was a few months earlier. I mean, that was focused on TV and entertainment way more than actual gaming. But the thought, the hope, was that they would surely course correct for E3, right? They had plenty of time to figure something out, right? What followed was quite possibly the most catastrophic press conference in gaming history. Microsoft announced that the Xbox One would require an always online connection. Games would be locked to your account, making it nearly impossible to share or resell them. And the console would come bundled with a mandatory Kinect camera for the low price of $499. Now, I gotta love with you. I actually remember at the event when they announced the $499 price, I cheered. Now, for reference, I was really excited. This was my first time being at a console launch, but I think I was the only person in that room who was excited. If you play it back, the room is so quiet, although you'll hear very faintly, yeah, from an Austin in the back.
I'm excited to announce that Xbox One will launch this November in 21 markets around the world at $499 in the US and 499 euros in European markets.
Never admitted this. I don't think anyone noticed it, but this is my time to come clean. I was excited for the Xbox One price for 3 seconds before I realized that, wait a minute, that's not a good number. Whoops! But the real drama was just beginning. A few hours later, at Sony's conference, I witnessed what can only be described as a methodical dismantling of Xbox's entire strategy. Sony had clearly prepared for this moment, and they executed it perfectly.
This is how you share games on PS4.
Thanks! As if that wasn't enough, Sony also revealed that the PS4 would be more powerful than the Xbox One. And then came the knockout blow. $399.
I'm very proud to announce that PlayStation 4 will be available at $399.
The reaction in the room was as if they had just announced Half-Life 3. Now, maybe it's hindsight talking, but I swear, you could feel the energy in the room shift instantly. Within weeks, Microsoft's Don Mattrick was out, the Xbox team reversed almost every controversial decision, and pretty much all the goodwill that they had built out during the Xbox 360 era, it had evaporated, essentially overnight. Now what's fascinating is that this part of the story isn't really about the PS4 itself. It's about Sony's learning from the PS3's failure, while Microsoft seemingly forgot how to do anything good that they had done on the Xbox 360. What felt like a safe and maybe even a boring new PlayStation console suddenly became the more powerful, cheaper, and most importantly, the more consumer-friendly option in a single day. After the absolute slam dunk of an E3, Sony just had to stick the landing. On November 15th, 2013, the PlayStation 4 officially hit store shelves, and unlike the PS3's rocky $599 launch, this time everything just clicked. The sales numbers really tell the story. 1 million consoles in North America in a single day. Stores had to stop taking pre-orders because they literally couldn't guarantee stock. Right out of the gate, players started noticing the games simply ran better on PS4. We're talking titles hitting 1080p on PS4, whereas on the Xbox One, they were struggling at 900p or even 768p. Now, sure, that doesn't sound like a massive difference, on paper at least, but don't forget, the PS4 was also the cheaper console. This performance gap became a running theme that would define the early years of the generation. But the real victory, Sony wasn't bleeding money this time around. So let me break down the numbers. Each PS4 was estimated to cost around $381 to manufacture, and was of course sold at $400. even after factoring in the retailer margins. This was maybe not quite break even, but a whole lot closer than the PS3, which I'll remind you that Sony was losing over $200 per console at launch. Finally, PlayStation could focus on selling games instead of trying to climb out of a financial black hole. Now, of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. Watch Dogs, which was supposed to be the game that showed off the next gen and what it could do, it got delayed at the last minute. There were also some PlayStation fans who were a little bit salty that online gaming now required a paid PS Plus subscription, which, to be fair, was a pretty big change from the PlayStation 3's free online play. But these were minor speed bumps on what was an otherwise, if I'm honest with you, it was a victory lap. Remember that humble, practical approach that Sony took after the PS3 disaster? It was paying off big time, boy! Big time, boy! Big time! Paid off big time, boy! By early 2014, the sheer scale of Sony's success was becoming clear. The PS4 was selling faster than any previous PlayStation in the launch window, even the legendary PS2. Just think about that for a second. The safe and boring PS4 was outpacing what would be the best-selling console of all time. Now, while the PS4 didn't ultimately quite match the PS2's final sales figures, the momentum in those early days was absolutely wild. The game situation was particularly interesting. While first-party exclusives were a bit thin in these early years, something that would of course drastically change later on, third-party support was incredibly strong. Major franchises like Destiny chose PlayStation as their lead platform, Call of Duty DLC started coming to PS4 first instead of Xbox, and that performance advantage we saw at launch, it really became the norm because the PS4 was simply the best place to play. Unless you were sad and alone playing a Wii U in the corner, PlayStation was where it's at. Or actually, technically, I was playing Titanfall on the Xbox One, but we won't talk about that. By 2016, Sony had sold over 40 million PS4s, more than double the Xbox One's estimated numbers. The lead was so substantial that Microsoft actually stopped reporting Xbox sales figures altogether, probably out of embarrassment. Yikes. This led Sony to launch not one, not two, but 3 new pieces of hardware in 2016. The PS4 Slim, the PS4 Pro, and PlayStation VR. Each one represented a different bet on the future of gaming. But as you'll see, not all of them were a huge win. Let's start with the simplest one, the PS4 Slim. Like every PlayStation before it, this was just a smaller, cheaper version of the base console that brought the price down to $300. But this time, the Slim was completely overshadowed by its more ambitious sibling, the PS4 Pro. The idea was simple. Take the existing PlayStation 4 and give it some serious horsepower. The original PS4 launched right as 4K TVs were starting to hit the mainstream, but it was firmly designed for HD gaming. Sony's solution was clever. They kept the same basic architecture, but packed in a slightly faster CPU and a much beefier GPU. Paired with a new upscaling technique called checkerboard rendering, games could look dramatically better on 4K displays, even if most of the time they weren't running at actual native 4K. While the concept of a pro console feels normal today, it was a real gamble for Sony back in 2016. They priced it at $399, the same price point that the original PS4 launched at. Imagine a pro console launching at the same price that the original one had a couple years ago. What a novel concept. And importantly, they also included a 1TB hard drive with it. Not to be outdone, at E3 2016, Microsoft teased Project Scorpio as, quote, the most powerful console ever. But that wouldn't ship until late 2017, giving Sony a full 1-year head start in the premium console space. The Pro was relatively successful out of the gate. Reviews were positive, and while games did need specific patches to take advantage of the extra power, titles like Rise of the Tomb Raider and Horizon Zero Dawn showed what was possible. It wasn't all perfect though. Some people complained about the lack of an Ultra HD Blu-ray drive, something that you could find in the much cheaper Xbox One S. It was also not a super straightforward upgrade if you already owned a PS4. Sure, it looked better, but it was not a dramatic improvement in the way that a properly new generation would be. Then there was PlayStation VR. This is actually a longer story than you might remember. Sony first showed off Project Morpheus at GDC 2014, and I got hands-on with it a few months later at E3. Now it's easy to forget that this was peak VR hype. Oculus and HTC were promising the future of gaming, and Sony absolutely wanted a piece of that action. But Morpheus was clearly unfinished. Sony spent over 2 years showing it off at various trade shows before finally launching PlayStation VR in October of 2016, just weeks after the PS4 Pro. The final product felt, well, a little half-baked if I'm honest with you. Instead of developing new controllers, for example, Sony just reused the PlayStation Move controllers from the PS3 era. Mini USB ports and all. The price was the real killer though. The core PSVR headset with the breakout box, which was mandatory, cost $400, the same price as the PS4 Pro. Then you needed the $60 camera, which was absolutely mandatory and not included, and you also probably wanted the $80 Move controllers. Even with some of the stuff being bundled together and you'd save a few bucks, like, it was a huge ask, especially considering that you also needed a PS4 as well. Sony eventually sold about 5 million PSVR headsets, which sounds okay until you realize that a lot of these were sold at deep discounts. For the last couple of years of the PS4's life, you could regularly find PSVR bundles for only $200 to $300. The PS4 Pro fared quite a bit better. At the end of the PS4's run, it's estimated that around 20% of all PS4s sold were Pros. Now that's not earth-shattering, but it was a decent chunk of premium sales that proved that there was absolutely a market for mid-generation upgrades. When Microsoft finally launched the Xbox One X in 2017, it did take back the most powerful console crown with objectively better 4K performance. But ultimately, it wasn't enough to change the narrative on the Xbox One. That ship had well and truly sailed in 2013. Looking back, there is absolutely no doubt that the PlayStation 4 is one of the most successful consoles, not only for Sony, but of all time. With over 117 million sales, it's second only to the juggernaut that was the PS2, and it absolutely dominated the Xbox One, selling at least twice as many units. And I guess the Wii U existed somewhere in the middle of there too. But for me, the PS4, its legacy is not just about the sales numbers. The PlayStation 4 completely transformed how Sony approached console design. Its straightforward, PC-like architecture became the blueprint not just for the PS5, but even the current Xbox Series consoles that are basically using the same playbook. Powerful but familiar hardware the developers actually want to work with. But maybe the PS4's most important legacy is how it cemented Sony's position as the dominant force in gaming. Now to be fair, it wasn't just sheer Sony genius that brought them back on top. I'd argue that half the reason the PlayStation 4 was so dominant was because just how much Microsoft shot themselves in the foot. If at E3 they had unveiled an Xbox One that didn't require Kinect, that didn't try to lock down used games, and wasn't a more expensive, less powerful alternative to the PS4, honestly, this generation may have gone a very different way. But Microsoft threw away their goodwill, and it's something that they've never really recovered from. It's almost ironic. The PS4 was Sony's least ambitious console, but it might just be their most influential. It wasn't revolutionary like the PS1, it didn't define an era like the PS2, and it didn't push technology to its limits like the PS3. The PS4 just focused on being a really good gaming console. And sometimes, that's exactly what you need.